Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The teacher who discovered a 7-year-old's secret hospital visits. A story of hope against all odds misses. Catherine Riley adjusted her reading glasses as she settled into her familiar spot at the weathered oak desk that had witnessed 23 years of childhood dreams, fears, and discoveries. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Elementary School, casting dancing shadows across the colorful artwork that decorated every inch of her third-grade classroom walls. It was a crisp Wednesday morning in March, and the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of crayons and construction paper that seemed permanently embedded in the very walls of the building. For the past 30 minutes, Catherine had been reviewing the latest batch of family portrait assignments, a monthly project she used to gauge her students' emotional well-being and home situations. Most drawings followed predictable patterns. Stick figure families standing in front of houses with triangular roofs, pets that looked more like furry blobs, and suns with radiating lines that children seemed genetically programmed to include in every outdoor scene. But when she reached the artwork submitted by 8-year-old Marcus Thompson, her coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. The drawing was unlike anything she had seen in her decades of teaching. Instead of the typical cheerful family scene, Marcus had created a detailed and disturbing accurate depiction of a hospital room. The level of precision was startling for a child his age. He had carefully drawn a figure lying motionless in a bed, surrounded by medical equipment that most 8-year-olds would never have encountered. Ventilators, IV poles, heart monitors, and feeding tubes were all rendered with an attention to detail that made Catherine's hands tremble slightly. Beneath the drawing, in Marcus's careful block letters, were the words, "My dad is still dreaming, but I visit him every week with Grandma Rose." Catherine's heart began to race as she recalled Marcus's family history from his enrollment records. According to the documentation she had reviewed at the beginning of the school year, Marcus Thompson lived with his single mother, Alina Thompson, age 31. His father, Fire Captain David Thompson, had been involved in a devastating accident during a chemical plant explosion 6 years ago, and had been in a vegetative state ever since. Most importantly, the school records clearly indicated that Marcus had no living grandparents on either side of his family. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was the kind of tight-knit community where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where the local coffee shop served as an unofficial information hub, and where first responders weren't just public servants, but genuine hometown heroes. Nestled between the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania and the meandering Susquehanna River, this town of 14,000 residents prided itself on old-fashioned values and taking care of their own. Catherine had chosen to make Millbrook her home 18 years ago, fresh out of Penn State with her elementary education degree, and a heart full of idealistic dreams about shaping young minds. At 44, she had never married, instead dedicating her life to her students and sharing her modest colonial-style home with 3 rescue dogs and countless stacks of graded papers that seemed to multiply overnight. The loss of her younger brother in a military helicopter crash in Iraq had taught Catherine to recognize the subtle signs of grief in children's faces. She had learned to spot the way trauma settled into small shoulders, how unprocessed sorrow could manifest in artwork, and how children often carried family secrets that adults assumed they were too young to understand. The Thompson family had once represented the best of what Millbrook had to offer. Captain David Thompson, 36 years old and built like the college football player he had once been, had earned his reputation through countless acts of heroism, running toward danger when others fled in the opposite direction. His wife Alina, a former registered nurse who had specialized in pediatric care, had left her career to become a full-time caregiver when tragedy forever altered their family's trajectory. Marcus, now 8 years old, possessed his father's quiet determination and his mother's artistic sensitivity. Though few adults had noticed how his drawings had grown progressively darker and more complex over the months since school had started. Riverside Elementary School served as a beacon of stability in Marcus's fractured world. The single-story brick building housed 300 students, its corridors lined with colorful displays of student achievements and seasonal decorations that changed with predictable regularity. Catherine's classroom occupied the coveted corner position, with windows overlooking both the playground where children's laughter punctuated the daily routine and the main street where parents dropped off their precious cargo each morning. Her classroom walls displayed every student's work without exception, following her personal philosophy that sometimes a child's crayon drawing revealed more essential truth than any standardized assessment could measure. Principal Robert Martinez, a compassionate but no-nonsense administrator in his mid-50s, had learned to trust Catherine's instincts about troubled students completely. School counselor Dr. Amy Chen, despite being relatively new to her position after completing her graduate work, frequently sought Catherine's guidance about reading between the lines of childhood behavior. Together, they had formed an unofficial early warning system for students who needed more than academic instruction to navigate their complicated lives successfully. October 22nd, 2018, had begun like countless other autumn days in Millbrook. The crisp air carried the nostalgic scent of burning leaves and the promise of another peaceful day in their small-town sanctuary. Captain David Thompson had kissed his wife Alina goodbye at 6:45 in the morning, playfully messed up 3-year-old Marcus's hair as the toddler giggled over his breakfast cereal, and driven to Station House Number 2 with his characteristic sense of purpose and duty. He had no way of knowing that before the evening news aired, everything his young family had built together would be reduced to ashes and uncertainty. The emergency call crackled through the radio at 2:37 in the afternoon. Chemical plant explosion on Industrial Drive. Multiple casualties reported. Possible hazardous material leak. David's crew responded within 4 minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet afternoon like harbingers of the devastation they were about to encounter. The Riverside Chemical Processing Plant had been a cornerstone of the local economy for over 30 years, providing steady employment for nearly 200 families in the area. But years of deferred maintenance and cost-cutting measures had created a ticking time bomb that finally exploded during a routine cleaning procedure gone catastrophically wrong. When David's team arrived on scene, they found chaos beyond anything their training had prepared them for. The main processing building was engulfed in flames that burned with unnatural colors, indicating the presence of toxic chemicals that made the air itself dangerous to breathe. 7 workers were trapped in the basement level, overcome by noxious fumes and unable to reach the exits through the maze of twisted metal and debris. David led the rescue operation with the calm professionalism that had made him a respected leader among his peers. One by one, his team extracted the trapped workers through a partially collapsed stairwell, each rescue requiring precise coordination and split-second timing as the building continued to deteriorate around them. The first worker to be brought out was Maria Santos, a 42-year-old quality control specialist who had been working at the plant for 15 years. Despite suffering from severe smoke inhalation, she was conscious and able to provide crucial information about the location of her remaining colleagues. The second rescue involved 2 maintenance workers, brothers named Carlos and Miguel Rivera, who had been performing routine equipment checks when the explosion occurred. Both men were unconscious, but breathing when David's team reached them, their bodies showing signs of chemical exposure that would require specialized medical treatment. The third and fourth workers were found together in a storage room where they had taken shelter when the initial blast knocked out the primary lighting system. Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old laboratory technician, and Robert Kim, a 35-year-old process engineer, had used wet towels to create makeshift filters over their faces, a decision that likely saved their lives. As David prepared to make one final sweep of the basement level, his radio crackled with an urgent message from the incident commander. "Captain Thompson, we've got reports of one more worker possibly trapped in the east section chemical storage area. Building integrity is critical. You have maybe 5 minutes before we have to evacuate everyone." Without hesitation, David adjusted his breathing apparatus and disappeared into the smoke-filled labyrinth of the basement level. His teammates watched anxiously as his powerful silhouette was swallowed by the toxic darkness that billowed from the stairwell like smoke from the mouth of hell itself. The final worker, Thomas Bradley, a 51-year-old supervisor with 2 decades of experience at the plant, was found unconscious near a pile of chemical containers that had toppled during the explosion. David had just managed to lift the man onto his shoulders when a secondary explosion in the upper levels sent a massive steel beam crashing down through the weakened floor. The impact occurred at exactly 3:04 p.m. The beam, weighing over 900 pounds and superheated by the chemical fire above, struck David directly across his helmet and upper back, driving him to the concrete floor with devastating force. The sound of his protective equipment cracking echoed through his radio communication system like a gunshot, followed by an ominous silence that chilled every firefighter on the scene. By the time his crew managed to extract both David and the final worker from the wreckage, blood was seeping through David's protective gear, and his eyes had rolled back to show only white. The impact had caused severe traumatic brain injury, crushing several vertebrae and causing internal bleeding that threatened his life moment by moment. Alina received the phone call while she was finishing her volunteer shift at the local food bank. A weekly commitment she maintained to stay connected with her community. Words seemed to come from another dimension. Critical condition, severe head trauma, life flight to University Medical Center in Philadelphia. The 90-minute drive to Philadelphia became a 45-minute nightmare as Alina pushed her aging Honda Civic to its limits, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel, and her mind refusing to accept the possibility that the man who had kissed her goodbye that morning might never kiss her again. The first months following David's accident brought an overwhelming outpouring of community support that both sustained and overwhelmed the Thompson family. Local firefighters organized benefit dinners that raised over $50,000. Area businesses donated gift certificates, groceries, and services. Neighbors appeared at their door with home-cooked meals and offers to babysit Marcus whenever Alina needed to spend time at the hospital. The town rallied around their fallen hero with the fierce loyalty that small communities reserve for their own. Church congregations across 3 counties included David in their weekly prayers. The high school football team dedicated their entire season to his recovery. The mayor declared October 22nd as Captain Thompson Courage Day, an annual recognition that would honor first responders throughout the region. But as weeks stretched into months and David remained unresponsive in the intensive care unit, the initial flood of support began to recede like floodwater after a storm. Bills continued to arrive with relentless regularity. Groceries still needed to be purchased. Marcus required the same daily care and attention despite his father's absence. And Alina found herself caught between maintaining hope for David's recovery and facing the practical realities of single parenthood. The investigation into the chemical plant explosion concluded after 8 weeks. The state fire marshal's comprehensive report cited multiple safety violations, inadequate maintenance of critical systems, and a corporate culture that prioritized profits over worker safety. The plant's parent company ultimately faced millions of dollars in fines and civil lawsuits, but no criminal charges were filed against individual executives. For Alina, the investigation's findings provided little comfort. Her husband remained connected to machines that breathed for him, fed him, and monitored every biological function, while she struggled to make sense of a future that looked nothing like the life they had planned together. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief neurologist overseeing David's care at University Medical Center, had delivered difficult prognoses to hundreds of families over her 20-year career. But something about the Thompson case haunted her professional objectivity. David's brain injury was severe, classified as a diffuse axonal injury with extensive damage to the brain stem regions that controlled consciousness and basic life functions. Medical textbooks suggested that patients who remained unconscious for more than 6 months rarely showed meaningful recovery. After 2 years, the likelihood of regaining consciousness dropped to less than 2%. Yet Dr. Williams found herself reluctant to recommend discontinuing life support, partly because of David's young age and previously excellent health, but mostly because of something indefinable she observed during Alina's visits. During the early months, Alina maintained an exhausting schedule of hospital visits, driving the 90 minutes each way 3 times per week, while juggling part-time work as a home health aide and full-time motherhood. She would sit beside David's bed for hours, reading him news articles, playing his favorite music, and maintaining one-sided conversations about Marcus's development and daily activities. What Dr. Williams noticed, and what she carefully documented in David's medical records, were subtle but consistent changes in his vital signs during Alina's visits. His heart rate would stabilize. His blood pressure readings improved. Most intriguingly, his sleep-wake cycles seemed to align more closely with normal patterns during periods when Alina was present. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Williams said during one of their regular consultations, "I want you to know that while David's condition remains critical, we are observing some interesting patterns in his neurological responses. The human brain is remarkably complex, and we don't fully understand all the factors that influence recovery from severe trauma." Alina clung to these carefully worded encouragements like lifelines, but the practical demands of daily survival gradually forced her to reduce her hospital visits. The financial strain of maintaining their household on her limited income, combined with the emotional exhaustion of hoping for changes that never seemed to come, slowly wore down her initial determination. By the time Marcus started first grade, Alina's visits to see David had decreased to once per week, then once every 2 weeks, and eventually to monthly visits that felt more like obligations than expressions of love. The guilt of this practical abandonment ate at her constantly, but she couldn't figure out how to balance grieving for her husband with raising their son. March 15th, 2024, should have been just another family drawing assignment at Riverside Elementary School. Catherine had asked her third graders to create pictures showing their families engaged in favorite activities together. Expecting the usual collection of stick figures around dinner tables, at playgrounds, or watching television. What she received from Marcus Thompson, however, was something that would disturb her sleep for weeks to come. The drawing demonstrated disturbing sophistication for an 8-year-old child. Unlike his classmates' cheerful scribbles, Marcus had meticulously rendered a hospital room with startling accuracy and attention to detail. The hospital bed dominated the center of the composition, with a human figure lying motionless beneath precisely drawn white sheets. Medical equipment surrounded the bed like mechanical sentinels. Ventilators with clearly defined tubes and dials, IV poles supporting bags of fluid, heart monitors displaying wavy lines that Marcus had somehow managed to draw with remarkable precision for his age. Most unsettling of all, 3 figures stood around the bed holding hands in a circle. A woman with shoulder-length brown hair, a small boy, and an elderly woman whose face was deliberately obscured by heavy black crayon strokes that had been applied with obvious emotional intensity. Catherine stared at the drawing for several long minutes, her trained eye recognizing both artistic talent and psychological distress. When she finally called Marcus to her desk, the boy approached with the same quiet resignation that had characterized his behavior since the beginning of the school year. His small shoulders seemed to carry an invisible burden that grew heavier with each passing day. "Marcus, sweetheart," Catherine said gently, kneeling to meet his eyes at his level. "Can you tell me about your drawing? This looks like it takes place in a hospital." The boy nodded with solemn matter-of-factness that chilled Catherine more than tears would have. "That's my dad. He's sleeping in the big bed, with all the machines helping him breathe. Mom says he's been sleeping for a really, really long time, and the doctors don't know when he'll wake up." Catherine's breath caught as she pointed to the mysterious third figure. "And who is this lady standing with you and your mom?" Marcus's face brightened slightly for the first time during their conversation. "That's Grandma Rose. She takes me to see Dad every Tuesday and Friday after school. Sometimes on Saturdays too, if Mom has to work her second job at the restaurant. Grandma Rose tells me stories about when Dad was brave and saved people from fires and accidents." According to Marcus's school enrollment records, which Catherine had reviewed carefully at the beginning of the academic year, the boy had no living grandparents. Alina's parents had died in a car accident when she was in college, and David's mother had passed away from cancer 2 years before Marcus was born. David's father had suffered a fatal heart attack the previous year. The presence of this mysterious Grandma Rose immediately raised red flags in Catherine's experienced mind. 23 years of teaching had taught her to recognize the warning signs of potentially dangerous situations involving children. "How often do you visit your dad, honey?" Catherine asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral while her mind raced through possible explanations. "Every Tuesday and Friday after school," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Sometimes Saturdays too, if Mom doesn't have to work at the restaurant. Grandma Rose picks me up right here at school, and we drive to Philadelphia to see Dad. We bring him drawings like this one, and sometimes candy bars, even though the nurses say he can't eat them right now." Catherine felt her pulse quicken. If Marcus was visiting his father twice a week, Alina Thompson had to know about these trips. But during their parent-teacher conference in November, Alina had specifically mentioned that Marcus hadn't been to the hospital since he was 4 years old, claiming that seeing his father in a vegetative state was too traumatic for a young child to handle. "Marcus," Catherine said carefully, "does your mom go with you when you visit your dad?" The boy shook his head, suddenly looking uncomfortable for the first time during their conversation. "Mom works a lot to pay for our apartment and food. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping, and she gets really tired. Grandma Rose says Mom needs to rest, so we don't tell her about all our visits. It's our special secret, and Grandma Rose says secrets can be good when they help people we love." The word secret sent alarm bells ringing in Catherine's head. 2 decades of mandatory reporting training had taught her that when adults instructed children to keep secrets from their parents, something was seriously wrong. The situation could range from well-meaning but misguided interference to something much more sinister. Catherine forced herself to maintain a calm demeanor while internally planning her next steps. "These are very detailed drawings, Marcus. You're quite an artist, but I want you to know that you can always talk to me if you need help with anything, okay? And remember, adults shouldn't ask children to keep important secrets from their parents." Marcus nodded, but Catherine could see confusion clouding his young eyes. Whoever this Grandma Rose was, she had clearly positioned herself as a trustworthy figure in the boy's life, making it difficult for him to understand why their arrangement might be problematic. After lunch, Catherine found Dr. Amy Chen in her office grading papers and preparing for afternoon counseling sessions. The young counselor listened with growing alarm as Catherine described Marcus's drawing, and their subsequent conversation about his regular hospital visits with a woman who claimed to be his grandmother. "We need to contact Child Protective Services immediately, Doctor," Chen said, her voice tight with concern. "If someone is taking this child to visit his comatose father without his mother's knowledge or consent, we're looking at a potential kidnapping situation. This could be anything from well-meaning but misguided help to something much more serious." Catherine nodded, though something in her professional instincts told her the situation was more complicated than simple abduction or abuse. Marcus showed none of the classic behavioral signs of trauma or fear. If anything, he seemed more emotionally stable and articulate when discussing his mysterious grandmother than when talking about his mother's long work hours or his father's medical condition. "I think we should try to contact Alina Thompson before involving social services," Catherine suggested. "Maybe there's an explanation we're not seeing. Sometimes family situations are more complex than they appear on official documents." "Doctor." Chen shook her head firmly. "Catherine, I understand your instinct to give people the benefit of the doubt, but protocol requires us to report suspected child endangerment immediately. We can interview the mother afterward, but our first responsibility is protecting Marcus from potential harm." Within 2 hours, Janet Morrison from the County Child Protective Services was sitting in Principal Martinez's office, reviewing Marcus's drawing and Catherine's written account of their conversation. Janet, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 30s, with over a decade of experience investigating family situations, had seen enough cases to recognize potential red flags, while also understanding the importance of gathering all relevant facts before drawing conclusions. "I'll need to interview the child separately, then speak with his mother," Janet declared. "In the meantime, I want this boy monitored closely. If someone is manipulating him or using him to gain unauthorized access to his father, we need to identify them quickly and determine their motives." As the dismissal bell rang and children flooded the hallways with their usual end-of-day excitement and energy, Catherine positioned herself near the main entrance to observe who would be picking up Marcus. Her heart was pounding as she watched the steady stream of parents, caregivers, and older siblings collecting their charges for the journey home. At 3:25, Catherine spotted Marcus walking toward the parking lot beside a woman who matched his description perfectly. Approximately 60 years old, with short silver hair, and wearing a faded denim jacket over dark slacks. The woman moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable with children, and Marcus skipped alongside her with obvious affection and trust. Catherine made a quick decision that would later prove crucial to understanding the full complexity of the situation. Instead of immediately notifying authorities, she chose to follow the pair at a discreet distance, hoping to gather more information about this mysterious Grandma Rose and her relationship with the Thompson family. The woman's vehicle was a well-maintained older model Toyota Camry with Pennsylvania license plates. Catherine memorized the plate number while watching the woman help Marcus into the back seat and carefully adjust his seatbelt, actions that suggested genuine care rather than sinister intent. Catherine followed them onto Interstate 76 toward Philadelphia, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping their vehicle in sight. The 90-minute journey gave her time to reflect on what she knew versus what she suspected about Marcus's situation. The boy's drawings over recent months had grown increasingly detailed in their depiction of medical equipment, suggesting regular exposure to hospital environments. His vocabulary included medical terminology that most 8-year-olds wouldn't know. Ventilator, IV drip, cardiac monitor, intubation. Most telling of all, he spoke about his father's condition with an acceptance that seemed both mature and heartbreaking, as if he understood things that the adults in his life were trying to shield him from. University Medical Center's intensive care unit occupied the entire 6th floor of the main building. The corridors buzzed with the quiet efficiency of medical professionals managing life and death decisions around the clock. Catherine approached the nurse's station with the nervous energy of someone stepping far outside their comfort zone. Unsure whether her elementary school teacher credentials would carry any weight in this environment of advanced medical care. "I'm looking for information about Captain David Thompson," she told the charge nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "I'm his son's teacher, and we have some concerns about the family situation that I'm hoping you can help clarify." The nurse, whose badge identified her as Linda Chen, looked up from her computer screen with immediate recognition. "Oh, you must be asking about little Marcus. Such a sweet boy. He's been coming here regularly with his grandmother for about 8 months now. Always brings his father drawings and tells him about school. The whole staff has grown quite fond of him." Catherine felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of relief and continued concern. "His grandmother, can you describe her?" Linda's expression grew thoughtful as she accessed her memories. Older woman, maybe early 60s, short silver hair. Always wears some kind of jacket with patches on it. I think they're firefighter insignia. She knows all the medical staff by name and seems very familiar with David's case and treatment protocols. She told us she was David's former partner from the fire department, though I always thought it was strange that she and Alina never came to visit together. Catherine felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Alina is David's wife, but according to family records, both sets of Marcus's grandparents are deceased. There shouldn't be any grandmother bringing him here. The color drained from Linda's face as the implications became clear. "Are you telling me we've been allowing an unauthorized person to visit our patient? Someone who's been bringing a child here under false family relationships?" "I don't know exactly what I'm telling you yet," Catherine admitted, "but I need to understand who this woman is and why she's taken such a personal interest in this family. Can you show me any visitor logs or documentation?" Linda hesitated, clearly torn between patient privacy regulations and growing concern about the situation they had unknowingly allowed to continue. "I can't share official medical records without proper authorization, but I can tell you that Rose Martinez has been signing in regularly for months. She always arrives on Tuesday and Friday afternoons, sometimes Saturdays. She genuinely seems to care about both David and Marcus, and her visits appear to have a positive effect on the patient's vital signs." The name Martinez triggered a memory in Catherine's mind. She recalled reading newspaper coverage of the chemical plant explosion 6 years earlier, how Captain Thompson had led a heroic rescue operation that saved 7 workers before being critically injured himself. She made a mental note to research whether Rose Martinez had any connection to that incident or to David's professional career. "Has Alina Thompson been here recently?" Catherine asked. Linda's expression grew sad. "Not for several weeks. The last few times she came, she seemed completely overwhelmed, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Our financial counselor has been trying to reach her about payment arrangements and insurance issues, but she hasn't returned calls. It's heartbreaking, really. You can see how much she loves her husband, but the situation seems to be breaking her apart emotionally and financially." Leaving the hospital with more questions than answers, Catherine decided to make an unscheduled visit to Alina Thompson's apartment. The address from school records led her to a subsidized housing complex on the outskirts of Millbrook, where peeling paint and broken playground equipment testified to the financial struggles of its residents. Alina's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. Its door was marked by a wreath of artificial flowers that had faded from prolonged exposure to fluorescent hallway lighting. Alina answered the door wearing her restaurant uniform, a polyester dress with stains that suggested a long shift dealing with difficult customers and inadequate tips. Her face showed the exhaustion of someone juggling multiple jobs while managing impossible responsibilities. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once vibrant brown hair hung limp around shoulders that seemed permanently hunched from carrying emotional burdens too heavy for one person to bear. "Mrs. Riley, is everything okay with Marcus?" Alina asked immediately, fear flickering across her features like lightning before a storm. "May I come in? I need to talk to you about something important concerning Marcus and your family situation." Alina's small living room reflected a life that had been stripped down to absolute essentials. A fold-out couch served as both seating area and sleeping space. Marcus's school papers and art projects covered most surfaces, creating a shrine to childhood achievement in an adult world that had been devastated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Photographs of happier times, Alina and David's wedding, family vacations to beaches and amusement parks. David, in his firefighter's dress uniform, watched over the sparse room like guardian angels of a life that had been torn apart by a single moment of industrial negligence. "Alina," Catherine began gently, settling onto the edge of the couch. "Marcus drew a picture at school today that concerns me deeply. It shows him visiting his father in the hospital with someone he calls Grandma Rose. He says he goes there twice a week, sometimes 3 times. I need to understand what's happening here." Alina's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally something that looked like defeat mixed with relief. She sank onto the couch beside Catherine, her hands covering her face, as if she could hide from a conversation she had been dreading for months. "I didn't know he was still going," Alina whispered through her fingers. "I told Rose months ago that the visits had to stop, that they were too confusing for Marcus and too complicated for our family. But Marcus kept asking about his daddy, and I couldn't bear to see him so sad and confused about why his father never came home." "Who is Rose Martinez?" Catherine asked gently. Alina's hands dropped to her lap, revealing eyes bright with unshed tears and years. of accumulated grief. She was David's partner before he made captain. They worked together for 9 years, saved dozens of lives, became like family to each other. Rose was supposed to go into that chemical plant with David the day of the explosion. But she had injured her back, responding to a car accident earlier that morning. She blames herself for not being there to help him, for not being able to prevent what happened. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Catherine's mind with crystalline clarity. She's been taking Marcus to see his father because she feels guilty about the accident. At first, I was grateful, Alina continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally shared the burden she had been carrying alone. After the explosion, Rose was incredibly supportive. She helped with medical decisions when I was too overwhelmed to think clearly. She knew all the right questions to ask doctors and understood the firefighter disability benefits system better than I did. Alina stood and walked to the window, staring out at a parking lot where broken dreams seemed to accumulate like wind-blown trash. But then Rose started suggesting that maybe Marcus should see his father regularly, that it might somehow help both of them process what had happened. I was against it initially. A 3-year-old doesn't need to see his daddy connected to machines, barely breathing on his own. But Rose was so persistent, and she seemed to genuinely believe it would help Marcus understand and cope. Catherine leaned forward with growing understanding. When did you realize it had become a problem? About 10 months ago, Marcus started having nightmares. He'd wake up crying, saying Daddy was trying to talk to him but couldn't make any sounds. Rose insisted this was normal, that children process grief differently than adults. She convinced me that cutting off the visits abruptly would be more traumatic than continuing them with proper emotional support. Alina turned back from the window, shame and exhaustion warring across her features. I stopped going with them because I couldn't handle seeing David like that anymore. Every visit felt like losing him all over again, like reopening a wound that never had a chance to heal. Rose said she understood, that she could handle the visits herself while I focused on keeping our lives together financially. But you told me during our conference that Marcus hadn't been to the hospital since he was 4 years old. Alina's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I lied. I've been lying to everyone, including myself. The truth is, I've been working 3 jobs to keep us afloat financially, and I was grateful that someone else was handling something I couldn't bear to do myself. Rose's visits gave me 2 afternoons a week when I didn't have to worry about childcare, and Marcus always seemed happy and well cared for when she brought him home. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a key turning in the front door lock. Marcus entered the apartment, followed by the woman Catherine had observed at school, Rose Martinez, wearing her firefighter's jacket over civilian clothes, and carrying a small backpack that presumably contained snacks and activities for their hospital visits. Rose froze when she saw Catherine, clearly recognizing that their long-standing arrangement had been discovered and was about to be scrutinized by outside authorities. Rose Martinez, I presume, Catherine said, standing to face the woman who had become such a controversial figure in young Marcus's life. I think we need to have a very honest conversation about what's been happening here. Rose Martinez stood in the doorway for several long seconds, her weathered hands still resting protectively on Marcus's small shoulders. The silence stretched between the three women like a taut wire, crackling with unspoken accusations and years of accumulated guilt, love, and desperate improvisation. Marcus looked between the adults with the intuitive awareness that children develop when they sense their world shifting beneath their feet, recognizing that something significant was happening even if he couldn't fully understand the implications. "Mrs. Riley," Rose said finally, her voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who had breathed too much smoke over decades of firefighting career. "I suppose you're here about the boys' drawings and our visits to see David." Catherine studied the woman before her, taking in the firefighter's insignia on her jacket, the calloused hands that spoke of decades of manual labor and life-saving work, and most importantly, the genuine affection and protective instinct in her eyes as she looked down at Marcus. This wasn't the calculating manipulator that her child protection training had taught her to expect, but rather someone carrying her own overwhelming burden of grief, guilt, and misplaced responsibility. "Marcus, sweetheart," Alina interrupted, forcing brightness into her voice while trying to manage her own anxiety about the confrontation taking place in her living room. "Why don't you go to your room and work on your homework? The grown-ups need to have an important conversation. But I want to tell Mrs. Riley about how Dad squeezed my hand yesterday," Marcus protested, his face lighting up with excitement. "Grandma Rose says he's getting stronger because we keep visiting him and talking to him. She says our voices help him remember who he is and why he needs to come back to us." Rose's face crumpled slightly at the boy's innocent words, revealing the depth of emotion she had been trying to contain. "Go on, Mijo," she said softly, using the Spanish endearment that had become natural during their months of shared visits. "Your mama and teacher need to have an adult conversation first." Once Marcus's bedroom door closed, Rose removed her jacket and sat heavily in the room's only armchair, suddenly looking every one of her 62 years. The confident, take-charge demeanor she maintained around Marcus gave way to something more vulnerable and uncertain. "I know what you're thinking," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Some crazy old firefighter who can't let go of the past, putting a child in the middle of her own guilt complex and potentially dangerous situation." "Actually," Catherine said, settling back onto the couch beside Alina, "I'm trying to understand why a decorated fire captain would risk her reputation and potentially face legal consequences to take a child to see his comatose father, apparently against his mother's stated wishes." Rose's laugh held no humor, only years of pain and self-recrimination. "Decorated? Is that what they're calling it now? 26 years on the force, and the only thing people will remember is that I wasn't there when my partner needed me most. I should have been in that chemical plant with David. We always worked as a team. That's how we stayed alive and kept other people alive all those years." Alina reached across the space between them, placing her hand on Rose's knee in a gesture of understanding that surprised Catherine with its familiarity. "Rose, we've talked about this before. The back injury wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known what was going to happen that day." "I could have insisted on going anyway," Rose interrupted, her voice rising with the passion of someone who had rehearsed this argument countless times in her own mind during sleepless nights. "I could have taken pain medication, worn a back brace, done whatever it took to be there watching David's back. Instead, I sat in the station house filling out incident reports, while my partner walked into that toxic inferno alone. Catherine felt she was witnessing something intensely private, a confession that had been building pressure for years like steam in a damaged boiler. Is that why you started taking Marcus to the hospital? To make amends for not being there when Captain Thompson needed you? Rose's eyes flashed with defensive anger, but underneath, Catherine could see the raw grief that drove all her actions. It started that way, maybe, but it became something entirely different when I saw how much that boy needed his father. Even if David couldn't respond in ways we could easily recognize. Do you know what it's like to watch an 8-year-old ask his daddy why he won't wake up? To see him leave drawings by the bedside hoping they'll somehow reach through the darkness of unconsciousness. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and Marcus's muffled voice as he talked to himself in his bedroom, probably narrating some elaborate story involving toy cars and superhero figures. It was the sound of childhood resilience, of a young mind finding ways to process an incomprehensible situation that most adults would struggle to handle. The hospital called this morning, Alina said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. They need a decision about David's long-term care. The insurance company is disputing coverage for extended life support and the medical bills. She trailed off, overwhelmed by the magnitude of numbers she couldn't possibly pay even if she worked around the clock. Rose leaned forward intently. What kind of decision are they asking for? Whether to continue aggressive life support or transition to comfort care only? The words came out in a rush, as if Alina could minimize their devastating impact by speaking them quickly. Dr. Williams says there's been no meaningful neurological change in 6 years. The hospital ethics committee is recommending that we consider allowing David to pass naturally without mechanical intervention. Catherine felt her heart clench as she watched Alina struggle with the impossible choice between hope and acceptance, between fighting for a miracle and acknowledging medical reality. How long do you have to make this decision? 72 hours. They want an answer by Friday afternoon. Alina's voice cracked with the weight of choosing her husband's fate. Rose stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back with barely contained energy. This is exactly why Marcus needs to see his father now, while he still can. That boy deserves a chance to say goodbye properly, to understand what's happening instead of being protected from reality in ways that will confuse him for years to come. He's 8 years old, Alina protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Children shouldn't have to make these kinds of impossible decisions or witness their parents dying. Children shouldn't have to wonder why their fathers disappear without explanation either. Rose shot back, with the intensity of someone who had watched too many families destroyed by well-meaning deception. I've observed Marcus these past months, Alina. He's not some fragile flower who needs to be sheltered from difficult truths. He's David's son, and he has his father's strength and courage. He can handle more reality than either of us want to admit. Catherine found herself in the unexpected position of mediating between two women who clearly cared deeply about the same child, but had fundamentally different approaches to protecting him. What does Marcus actually understand about his father's condition? What have you told him during your visits? Rose and Alina exchanged glances loaded with months of unspoken communication before Rose answered. more than either of us initially realized. Last week, he asked me directly if the machines were keeping his daddy alive. When I tried to deflect the question, he said he'd been listening to the nurses discuss David's case. He knows the medical terminology, understands that his father is very sick, and suspects that David might not get better. And how did he react to that knowledge? Catherine asked. Alina's tears finally spilled over as she answered. He asked if he could sing to his daddy. Some lullabies I used to sing when Marcus was a baby. He said maybe if Daddy heard familiar songs, he'd remember how to come home to us. The image of an 8-year-old boy singing lullabies to his unconscious father was almost too heartbreaking for Catherine to process. She thought about her own brother, killed in Iraq when she was 16, and how desperately she had wanted the chance to say goodbye, to have some control over their final moments together. There's something else, Rose said, her voice taking on an urgent tone that commanded attention. Yesterday, when Marcus was singing to David, his heart rate increased significantly. The nurse monitoring his vital signs noticed the change immediately. It might have been coincidence, but you think David can hear his son, Catherine finished, understanding the hope that was driving Rose's determination. I think that boy's voice is reaching his father in ways that medical science doesn't fully understand yet. And if we're going to make the decision to let David go, Marcus deserves to be part of that process, instead of being excluded from the most important moment in his young life. Alina stood and walked to Marcus's bedroom door, pressing her ear against the wood to listen. Whatever she heard there, the sound of her son playing, talking to his toys, creating imaginary worlds where problems had solutions, seemed to strengthen her resolve. When she turned back to face them, her expression had shifted from desperation to determination. I need to see him, Alina said with quiet strength. I haven't been to the hospital in 4 weeks because I couldn't bear watching David deteriorate. But if we're going to make this decision, I need to see my husband one more time. I need to talk to him myself before we decide whether to let him go. Rose nodded with obvious relief. I'll take you both today if you're ready. We can drive to Philadelphia together as a family. Catherine realized she was witnessing a turning point, a moment when avoidance gave way to acceptance, when family secrets yielded to honest communication, and when love became strong enough to face impossible choices. Would you like me to come with you? Sometimes it helps to have someone there who isn't carrying all the emotional weight of the situation. Alina's grateful smile was the first genuine expression of relief Catherine had seen from her. Would you really do that? I know it's asking a lot, but I feel like Marcus trusts you. And if this is going to be our last chance to be together as a complete family. Of course, Catherine said without hesitation. But first, we need to contact Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services. She's investigating this situation, and it's better if we're completely transparent about what's happening, rather than letting her discover details through other channels. If we're honest and cooperative, I think we can resolve this without anyone facing legal consequences. Rose's face darkened with concern. Social services. Why are they involved in our family situation? Because a school employee, me, reported concerns about a child being taken to visit his father by someone claiming to be his grandmother, Catherine explained carefully. Protocol required me to make that report, but now that I understand the full complexity of the situation, I believe we can resolve this without anyone losing custody or facing criminal charges. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared in his doorway clutching a new drawing. This one showed 4 figures standing around a hospital bed, himself, his mother, Rose, and a woman he had labeled Mrs. Riley in careful block letters. Above the bed, he had drawn what looked like a rainbow arching over the still form of his father. And along the bottom of the page, he had written hope in multiple colors. "I made this for Dad," Marcus announced with the matter-of-fact tone children use when addressing the impossible. "Grandma Rose says rainbows mean hope, and Mrs. Riley says art can tell stories that words can't express. Maybe this picture will help Dad understand that we all love him, even if he has to go to heaven to stop hurting." The 3 women stared at the drawing, each seeing in it the wisdom of a child who had somehow grasped the essential truth they had all been struggling to accept: that love sometimes means letting go, and that saying goodbye can be an act of courage rather than surrender. The drive to University Medical Center felt like a pilgrimage, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation with reality that Alina had been avoiding for months. Catherine sat in the passenger seat of Rose's pickup truck, watching the Pennsylvania countryside blur past, while Alina and Marcus occupied the back seat in unusual silence. Even Marcus, normally chatty during car rides, seemed to sense the gravity of their mission. He clutched his new drawing in one small fist, while his other hand remained firmly clasped in his mother's, as if he could anchor her to the present moment through physical connection. Janet Morrison met them in the hospital parking lot, her professional demeanor softened by the understanding that she was witnessing a family in crisis rather than investigating potential abuse or neglect. After Catherine's phone call explaining the full complexity of the situation, Janet had agreed to observe rather than intervene, recognizing that sometimes the most protective thing social services could do was allow a family to heal on its own terms. "Mrs. Thompson," Janet said, approaching Alina with gentle authority, "I want you to know that our primary concern is Marcus's well-being and safety. Ms. Martinez, I understand your relationship with this family is complicated, but taking a child to see his father without his mother's explicit knowledge raises serious questions about boundaries and proper consent procedures." Rose nodded, her firefighter's training making her comfortable with accepting accountability for her actions. "You're absolutely right. I overstepped appropriate boundaries, and I should have been more transparent with Alina about the frequency of our visits. I let my own guilt and grief cloud my judgment about what was truly best for Marcus." Alina took Marcus's hand as they approached the hospital entrance. "I should have been stronger," she admitted to the group. "I should have been the one taking him to see his father, instead of hiding from a situation I couldn't emotionally control. My son needed his mother to be brave, and I failed him in that responsibility." The elevator ride to the 6th floor ICU seemed to last forever. Marcus pressed himself against his mother's side, his usual excitement about visiting his father replaced by an almost ceremonial solemnity. He clutched his new drawing in one small fist, while his other hand remained firmly clasped in Alina's, as if he understood that this visit was different from all the others. David Thompson lay in bed 6 of the intensive care unit, his once powerful frame diminished by years of immobility and dependence on mechanical life support systems. Tubes and wires connected him to an array of monitors that beeped and hummed with electronic persistence, creating a technological symphony that had become the soundtrack of his existence. His face, once vibrant with the confidence of someone who ran toward danger to save others, had grown gaunt during his years of unconsciousness. His thick dark hair now showed premature streaks of gray, and his skin had the pale, waxy appearance of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in too long. But Catherine could still see traces of the heroic firefighter who had sacrificed his own safety to save 7 strangers from a toxic inferno. Alina approached the bedside with the hesitant steps of someone walking through an emotional minefield. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch David's cheek, and the tears she had been holding back for weeks finally broke free, like water through a crumbling dam. "Oh, David," she whispered, her voice thick with accumulated grief and regret. "I'm so sorry I stayed away for so long. I was scared and selfish, and I left you alone when you needed me most. I let my own pain become more important than being here for you." Marcus stepped forward and carefully placed his new drawing on the bedside table, positioning it where his father could see it if he opened his eyes. The boy's movements were deliberate and reverent, as if he were participating in a sacred ritual. "Hi, Dad," Marcus said in the matter-of-fact tone children use when addressing the impossible. "I brought you a new picture. Mrs. Riley says art can say things that words can't express, so I tried to draw how much we all love you and want you to be okay." Catherine watched the monitors carefully, not expecting any dramatic response, but unable to resist hoping that love might somehow penetrate the darkness of David's unconscious mind. For several minutes, the only sounds were the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator and Alina's quiet sobbing, as she reconnected with her husband after months of avoidance. Then Rose spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 6 years of accumulated guilt and unresolved grief. "David, it's Rose. I know you probably can't hear me, but I need to say this anyway. I should have been with you that day in the chemical plant. I should have ignored the back injury and gone into that building beside you, like we always did, like partners are supposed to do. Instead, I let you face the danger alone, and I've been carrying that failure with me every single day since." Janet Morrison observed from the corner of the room, taking notes not for her official report, but to process her own emotional response to witnessing such raw, honest grief. In her years of social work, she had seen families torn apart by tragedy and circumstances beyond their control, but she had rarely witnessed such genuine love persisting through seemingly impossible circumstances. "The doctors say we have to make a decision," Alina continued, her voice breaking as she spoke the words that had been haunting her for days, "about whether to keep the machines running or let you go peacefully. I don't know how to choose between hope and acceptance, David. I don't know how to be both mother and father to our son. I don't know how to say goodbye to the only man I've ever loved." Marcus climbed onto the chair beside his father's bed, bringing himself to eye level with the unconscious man who had once been his hero, his protector, his role model for what it meant to be brave in a dangerous world. "Dad, are you tired?" Marcus asked with the directness that only children possess. "Grandma Rose says sometimes people get too tired to keep fighting. and that's okay. She says heroes don't always win their battles, but they're still heroes because they tried their best to help other people. The boy began to sing in his clear, sweet voice, the same lullaby Alina had hummed to him as an infant, the melody that had once filled their home with warmth, and now filled this sterile hospital room with something that felt almost sacred. The song transformed the clinical space into something more human, more connected to love and family, and the bonds that persist even when everything else falls apart. Catherine found herself holding her breath, struck by the power of a child's love to create beauty and meaning in the midst of devastating loss. She thought about the hundreds of students she had taught over the years, how children often possessed a wisdom and acceptance that adults struggled to achieve, an ability to find hope in the darkest circumstances. Dr. Patricia Williams entered the room during Marcus's song, intending to discuss treatment options and decision timelines, but stopping short when she saw the family gathered around David's bed. As the hospital's senior neurologist, she had overseen David's care since the initial injury, watching hope gradually give way to medical reality over the course of 6 long years. "Mrs. Thompson," she said softly, waiting for Marcus to finish his song before speaking, "I see you've brought your son to visit today. How is he handling the situation?" Alina wiped her eyes and looked at her child with new respect and understanding. "Better than I am, honestly. He seems to understand things that I've been too afraid to acknowledge or discuss openly." Dr. Williams approached the monitors, checking readings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered difficult news to countless families. "I want you to know that whatever decision you make, there's no wrong choice here. David has fought longer and harder than anyone could have reasonably expected. If you choose to continue life support, we'll honor that decision and provide the best care possible. If you decide it's time to focus on comfort care and allowing natural death, we'll make sure he's peaceful and surrounded by the people who love him." Rose stepped forward with the directness of someone accustomed to dealing with life and death situations. "Doctor, is there any realistic possibility of meaningful recovery at this point? Any experimental treatments or procedures that might help David regain consciousness?" Dr. Williams's expression remained professionally neutral, but her tone carried the gentleness of someone who understood the difference between false hope and realistic optimism. After 6 years without any significant neurological improvement, the likelihood of meaningful recovery is essentially 0. The traumatic brain injury was severe, affecting multiple areas of the brain that control consciousness, memory, and basic cognitive function. His current state represents the maximum healing we can reasonably expect. Marcus looked up from his position beside his father's bed, his young face serious but not frightened. "Does that mean Dad's not coming home to live with us anymore?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, awaiting an answer, carrying the weight of a child's need to understand his changing world. Alina knelt beside her son's chair, taking his small hands in hers with infinite tenderness. "I think it means Dad might need to go to a different kind of home, sweetheart. A place where he won't hurt anymore, and where he can watch over us like a guardian angel. But his love for us will never go away, no matter what happens." "But I'm not ready to say goodbye," Marcus whispered, his composure finally cracking as the full reality of the situation began to penetrate his 8-year-old understanding. I have so many things I still want to tell him about school and friends, and the pictures I've been drawing. Catherine felt her own tears starting as she watched this family confront the impossible choice between letting go and holding on. In her 23 years of teaching, she had learned that children often possessed a clarity about difficult situations that adults struggled to achieve, an ability to accept painful truths with a grace that came from not yet learning to fear reality. As if responding to his son's distress, David's heart monitor showed a slight but noticeable change in rhythm. The electronic beeping that had maintained its steady pattern for months suddenly accelerated, registering a 15 beat per minute increase that caught Dr. Williams's immediate attention. "That's interesting, Doctor," Williams murmured, studying the monitor display with raised eyebrows. "That's the most significant cardiac response we've seen in over 2 years." His heart rate just increased substantially. Rose and Alina exchanged glances, both remembering previous instances when David had seemed to respond to Marcus's presence or voice. Hope flickered in Alina's eyes like a candle flame threatened by wind, but refusing to be extinguished completely. "What does that mean?" Alina asked urgently, her voice tight with renewed possibility. Could he be trying to communicate somehow? Could he actually be aware of what we're saying, Doctor? Williams studied the monitors more carefully, her scientific training warring with the inexplicable patterns she was observing in real time. It could be coincidental, but the timing suggests he might be responding to familiar voices, particularly your son's. It's not consciousness in any meaningful medical sense, but it indicates that some level of sensory processing might still be occurring at a neurological level. The monitor's sudden spike in activity sent ripples of both hope and confusion through the small group gathered around David's bedside. "Doctor," Williams called for additional monitoring equipment, her scientific curiosity warring with years of experience that had taught her not to read too much into isolated incidents that might raise false hopes. But as the afternoon progressed, it became increasingly clear that David's responses were neither random nor coincidental. Every time Marcus spoke directly to his father, the heart monitor registered subtle but measurable changes. When the boy sang his lullabies, David's blood pressure stabilized in ways that hadn't occurred in months of medical observation. Most remarkably, when Marcus placed his small hand on his father's arm and whispered, "I love you, Dad," the EEG monitoring brain activity showed patterns that Dr. Williams had never observed in a patient with such extensive neurological trauma. "This is medically unprecedented, Doctor," Williams admitted to Alina, and rose during a hushed conference in the hallway, while Marcus continued his one-sided conversation with his father. "I've been treating coma patients for 18 years, and I've never seen neurological responses this consistent or this specifically triggered by particular stimuli." Alina felt her heart racing with possibilities she had forced herself to abandon years ago. Does this mean he might actually wake up? Could he be aware of what we're saying, trapped inside his own body all this time? "Doctor." Williams chose her words carefully, unwilling to give false hope, but unable to dismiss the evidence she was witnessing. "What I can tell you is that your husband's brain is showing activity in response to your son's voice. that suggests some level of information processing is occurring. Whether that constitutes consciousness as we typically understand it, or represents the potential for meaningful recovery, I honestly cannot determine based on current medical knowledge. Rose leaned against the hallway wall, her legs suddenly unsteady as the implications hit her. Are you telling us that David has been aware this whole time? That he's been listening to us discuss whether to let him die, unable to respond or communicate his wishes? I'm telling you that the human brain is far more complex than our current understanding allows us to fully comprehend, Doctor. Williams replied with professional honesty. What we're observing today challenges everything I thought I knew about severe traumatic brain injury and long-term vegetative states. We're in uncharted territory here. Janet Morrison, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward with practical concerns. Doctor, from a legal and ethical standpoint, how does this change the family's decision-making timeline? If there's evidence of some level of awareness, doesn't that significantly affect the discussion about discontinuing life support? Doctor. Williams nodded grimly. It complicates everything substantially. The Hospital Ethics Committee will need to review these findings before any decisions about care withdrawal can proceed. We're looking at potentially weeks or months of additional testing, evaluation, and consultation with specialists from around the country. The implications hit Alina like a physical blow. Weeks or months meant continued medical bills that would drive them into complete bankruptcy. It meant more uncertainty, more emotional upheaval for Marcus during crucial developmental years, more hope followed by potential disappointment. The cruel irony was that evidence of David's awareness, which should have been cause for celebration, instead felt like another burden added to an already impossible situation. Catherine, who had been listening to the medical discussion while watching the family dynamics unfold, spoke up with practical concern. What if the financial obstacles could be addressed? Would that change how you approach David's treatment and evaluation? Alina laughed bitterly, the sound containing no humor. Mrs. Riley, we're already drowning in medical debt. The insurance company has been fighting every claim for months, and I'm working 3 jobs just to keep us housed and fed. Even if David could somehow recover partially, we'd lose everything paying for extended care and rehabilitation. Rose's expression suddenly shifted, as if a crucial memory had just surfaced from the depths of her guilt and grief. Alina, there's something I never told you about the chemical plant explosion. Something I should have mentioned years ago, but didn't want to complicate your grieving process when you were barely surviving emotionally. The group turned toward Rose, sensing that another revelation was about to reshape their understanding of the situation once again. Rose's weathered face showed the conflict of someone who had been carrying a significant secret for too long. The building owner, Marcus Delacroix, knew about the structural problems and safety violations 6 months before the explosion occurred. The state inspector filed a comprehensive report citing dangerous conditions in the chemical storage systems and emergency ventilation. Delacroix ignored all the recommendations because repairs would have cost him over $80,000 in upgrades. Alina stared at Rose with growing comprehension. Are you saying the accident was preventable? That David's injuries were the direct result of negligence that could have been addressed? I'm saying your husband's injuries were the direct result of corporate negligence that should have been corrected long before David ever set foot in that building. Rose replied with intensity. The fire department has been quietly investigating, and they found evidence that Delacroix falsified multiple inspection records to avoid making required safety improvements. Dr. Williams interrupted the conversation. This is clearly a legal matter that's beyond my medical expertise, but if negligence can be proven definitively, it could significantly impact insurance coverage and liability issues for David's long-term care costs. Catherine felt pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place with sudden clarity. Rose, why didn't you share this information earlier? This could have changed everything for Alina and Marcus financially. Rose's shoulders sagged with the weight of her explanation. Because I was afraid it would give Alina false hope about lawsuits and financial settlements, when she needed to focus on accepting medical reality and moving forward with her life. I thought I was protecting her from another potential disappointment, another battle she might not win. You're saying we might be able to hold someone legally accountable for what happened to David, Alina said, her voice growing stronger with each word. That there might be justice for our family and financial resources to provide proper care. More than justice, Rose replied with growing conviction. Marcus Delacroix has significant personal and corporate assets. If negligence can be proven conclusively in court, the settlement could cover all of David's medical expenses, both past and future, and provide financial security for your family regardless of whether he recovers. Janet Morrison pulled out her phone with professional efficiency. I know an attorney who specializes in negligence cases involving first responders and industrial accidents. If you're interested, I can arrange a consultation for tomorrow morning. Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from David's room. Marcus's voice carried into the hallway with unmistakable joy and amazement. Mom, Grandma Rose, Mrs. Riley, come quick. Dad opened his eyes and looked right at me. The adults rushed back into the room to find Marcus holding his father's hand, tears of pure joy streaming down his young face. David's eyes were indeed open, unfocused and cloudy, but undeniably present and aware. His gaze seemed to search the room before settling on Marcus's face, with something that looked remarkably like recognition. I was telling him about the rainbow picture and how much we all love him, Marcus explained breathlessly, and his eyes just opened up. Then he squeezed my hand back when I squeezed his hand. He knows I'm here, Doctor. Williams immediately began examining David, checking reflexes and responses with renewed urgency and hope. Mrs. Thompson, I need your permission to run a complete neurological workup immediately. What we're witnessing here goes far beyond anything documented in medical literature for patients with this type and duration of injury. Lena looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her unlikely support system. Rose, carrying years of guilt but genuine love for their family. Catherine, stepping far beyond her role as a teacher to advocate for their welfare. Janet, using her position to help rather than simply investigate. And most importantly, Marcus, whose innocent faith and persistent love had somehow accomplished what medical science had deemed impossible. Do it, Alina said, with quiet determination. Run every test available. And Rose, call that attorney immediately. If someone's negligence put my husband in this bed, they're going to pay for bringing him back out of it. As if responding to his wife's renewed determination and fighting spirit, David's eyelids fluttered again. This time his eyes opened more fully, still unfocused, but undeniably seeking connection. His lips moved soundlessly, as if trying to form words that his damaged brain couldn't quite access. But his hand tightened around Marcus's fingers in a deliberate movement that registered clearly on all the monitoring equipment. "Dad," Marcus whispered, leaning closer to his father's face. "Are you trying to say something? It's okay if you can't talk yet. Mrs. Riley says sometimes love is stronger than words anyway." David's gaze focused with increasing clarity on his son's face, and though no sound emerged from his throat, his eyes communicated recognition, love, and what looked remarkably like determination to fight his way back to full consciousness. Dr. Williams stared at the monitor readings, shaking her head in amazement at data that challenged everything she thought she understood about neurological recovery. "I need to call in specialists immediately. Neurologists, speech therapists, physical rehabilitation experts. If David is emerging from this vegetative state after 6 years, we're looking at completely uncharted medical territory." Rose wiped tears from her eyes, finally allowing herself to believe that her partner might survive the industrial disaster that had changed all their lives forever. "What can we do to help support his recovery?" "Keep talking to him, doctor," Williams advised with growing excitement. "Keep singing, keep sharing memories, keep letting him know he's loved and needed. Whatever's happening in his brain, your voices seem to be the key to bringing him back to consciousness and to his family." As evening approached and visiting hours drew to a close, the family gathered around David's bed for what they all sensed might be a turning point rather than an ending. Instead of facing uncertainty about death, they now faced uncertainty about recovery, about justice, about the possibility that love and persistence might actually triumph over seemingly impossible medical odds. Marcus climbed back onto his chair and began singing his father's favorite song, the same melody that had comforted him as an infant, and now seemed to be calling his father home from the darkness of unconsciousness. As his sweet voice filled the room with hope and determination, David's eyes opened again, this time staying open longer and focusing with increasing clarity on the faces of the people who had never stopped believing in his eventual return. 18 months after that transformative day in the hospital, the Thompson family gathered around their kitchen table for Sunday dinner. The first time in over 7 years that all members were present, conscious, and actively participating in family life. David sat in a wheelchair, his speech still deliberate and sometimes halting, but his eyes bright with the intelligence and love that had never truly left him. The settlement from Marcus Delacroix's negligence case had not only covered all medical expenses, both past and future, but provided enough financial security for Alina to reduce her work schedule dramatically and focus on David's rehabilitation and their family's healing process. The dining room of their new, fully accessible house was filled with the sounds of ordinary family life that had been absent for so long, Marcus chattering about his 4th grade experiences, Alina humming while she prepared meals, and David's slow but determined voice as he worked through his daily speech therapy exercises. Rose had officially retired from the fire department and become a permanent, welcomed fixture in their lives, finally able to call herself Grandma Rose, with legal and emotional legitimacy after Alina had asked her to become Marcus's official godmother. The grandmother role that had begun as deception and desperation had evolved into genuine family connection based on love, shared history, and mutual commitment to David's recovery. "Tell me about your art project again," David said to Marcus, his words carefully enunciated but warm with paternal pride and interest. The brain injury had left him with short-term memory challenges that required frequent repetition, but his long-term memories remained intact, creating bridges between his former life and his new reality as a recovering patient. Marcus proudly displayed his latest artwork, a family portrait showing all 4 adults who had become central to his world. His parents, Rose and Mrs. Riley, who continued to visit weekly, even though Marcus had transferred to a school closer to their new home. In the drawing, his father stood upright and strong, a representation of hope and future possibility rather than current medical reality, but one that the family had learned to embrace as a goal worth working toward. "This is us at the park next summer," Marcus explained patiently, having shared this information several times already due to his father's memory challenges. "You're standing up and pushing me on the swings because the physical therapists say you might be able to walk with assistance by then if you keep working hard in therapy." David's right hand, still weak but increasingly functional, reached out to ruffle his son's hair in a gesture that had once been automatic, but now required conscious effort and determination. "I'll keep working hard, buddy. For you and Mom, I'll never stop trying to get stronger." Alina watched this interaction with emotions that shifted between gratitude for what they had regained and grief for what they had lost. The man who had returned to them bore David's face, heart, and fundamental character. But 6 years of brain injury had changed aspects of his personality in ways, both subtle and significant. He was gentler now, more patient, more emotionally expressive, but also more vulnerable and dependent. The confident firefighter who had charged into burning buildings had been replaced by someone who sometimes needed help remembering what day of the week it was. Catherine arrived for her weekly visit, carrying a folder of Marcus's schoolwork and updates from Riverside Elementary, where she had started a program to help teachers recognize signs of family trauma and crisis in student artwork. The case had taught her valuable lessons about the importance of looking beyond surface behaviors to understand the complex dynamics affecting children's emotional development and academic performance. "How was physical therapy this week?" Catherine asked David, settling into the chair that had become hers during these family gatherings. "Challenging," David admitted with the honesty that brain injury had brought to all his communication. "But I stood for 2 full minutes yesterday without holding onto the parallel bars. The therapist says that's significant progress, and it gives me motivation to push through the difficult days." Rose, who had taken early retirement to help with David's care and Marcus's after-school needs, beamed with the pride of someone who had found new purpose in supporting recovery rather than fighting fires. "He's determined to walk Marcus to school before the boy graduates from elementary school. It gives him concrete goals to work toward when the therapy gets frustrating. Janet Morrison had officially closed the Child Protective Services case months ago, but she too had become part of their extended family network, checking in monthly to ensure Marcus's continued well-being and serving as an advocate for other families facing similar complex crises. Her detailed report on the Thompson case had become required reading in her department, illustrating how complicated family situations often required creative, compassionate solutions rather than rigid adherence to bureaucratic protocol. "There's something important we need to discuss as a family," Alina said, her tone indicating the significance of the conversation that was about to unfold. "Dr. Williams wants to present David's case at the International Conference on Neurological Recovery next month. His recovery patterns are apparently unprecedented in medical literature and could help other families dealing with similar injuries." David's expression grew thoughtful as he processed the implications with the deliberate consideration that had become characteristic of his communication style since the injury. What would that mean exactly? Having our private medical situation discussed by strangers. It means other families dealing with similar traumatic brain injuries might benefit from what we've learned about the power of consistent emotional connection during long-term coma states, Catherine explained. "Your response to Marcus's voice and presence has changed how doctors think about consciousness, awareness, and recovery potential in vegetative patients." Rose leaned forward with interest. "David, are you comfortable with that level of public exposure? Having your medical case studied and discussed by researchers and doctors around the world?" David was quiet for several minutes, processing the question with the careful deliberation that brain injury had imposed on all his decision-making processes. Finally, he spoke with the same moral clarity that had once driven him to run into burning buildings to save strangers. "If our story can help other families maintain hope and fight for their loved ones, then all the suffering wasn't meaningless. Maybe that's the real reason I came back, not just for us, but to show other people that recovery is possible even when medical professionals say it's hopeless." Marcus looked up from his coloring with the directness that had characterized his personality since early childhood. "Does that mean other kids' dads and moms might wake up too?" "It means other families might not give up hope as quickly as doctors suggest they should," Alina replied with growing understanding. "It means that love and persistent connection might be more powerful medicine than we ever realized." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Rose answered to find Chief Patricia Anderson, David's former supervisor at the fire department, holding a large wrapped package and wearing the nervous expression of someone about to make an important announcement. "Chief Anderson," David said, struggling slightly to rise from his wheelchair before settling back down with Alina's gentle assistance. "Good to see you. How's the department?" "Good to see you too, David." "Alina, Marcus." The chief nodded to each family member before her gaze settled on Marcus with particular warmth. "I came to talk to you about something important that the city council has been discussing for months." She unwrapped the package to reveal a beautiful bronze plaque commemorating David's heroic actions during the chemical plant explosion, along with an official proclamation declaring him a permanent honorary captain of the Millbrook Fire Department with full benefits and recognition. But that's not the main reason I'm here, Chief Anderson continued, her voice taking on the formal tone reserved for significant announcements. The department has established the Captain David Thompson Family Support Fund, designed to help other firefighter families dealing with catastrophic injuries and long-term recovery challenges. We want you and Alina to serve as advisors, helping other families navigate the medical, financial, and emotional challenges you've overcome. Alina felt tears welling up as she realized their struggle was being transformed into something that could genuinely help others facing similar battles against impossible odds. We'd be honored to help other families. No one should have to face these challenges alone. There's one more thing, the chief added, turning to Marcus with obvious affection. Young man, we've heard about your role in your father's recovery, and we'd like to make you an honorary junior firefighter. Would you be interested in visiting the station, learning about fire safety, and maybe helping with community education programs? Marcus's face lit up with excitement that reminded everyone of the carefree child he had been before tragedy complicated his young life. Could I see the big trucks and learn how to use the ladder and maybe help teach other kids about being safe? Rose laughed, the sound carrying more joy than had been heard in their home for years. Looks like the next generation of Thompson firefighters is already showing interest in protecting and serving the community. As evening approached and their guests prepared to leave, the family settled into their nighttime routine, ordinary domestic activities that felt precious after years of uncertainty and separation. Alina helped David with his evening medications, while Marcus prepared for bed. The simple rhythms of family life providing a foundation of stability that had been missing for too long. Dad, Marcus said, as David slowly maneuvered his wheelchair to the boy's bedside for their nightly conversation, are you glad you came back to us? David took his son's hand in the same gesture that had marked the beginning of his return to consciousness nearly 2 years earlier. Every single day, Marcus. Even the hard days when I can't remember things, or when my body won't do what I want it to do. Being here with you and Mom is worth all the struggle and hard work. Do you remember being asleep for so long? Marcus asked with the curiosity that had driven so many of their conversations about his father's condition and recovery. David's expression grew distant as he searched memories that remained frustratingly incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle scattered by trauma and time. Sometimes I remember voices calling to me from far away. I remember your songs and Mom crying, and Rose telling me stories about our work together. I think part of me was always trying to find my way home to you, even when my brain couldn't make my body respond. Alina joined them, sitting on the edge of Marcus's bed and completing the family circle that had been broken for so long, but was now restored in ways that felt both familiar and entirely new. We never stopped believing you'd find your way back to us, even when the doctors said it was impossible. As Marcus drifted off to sleep, Alina and David remained beside his bed, watching their son's peaceful face and marveling at how a child's unwavering faith and persistent love had somehow accomplished what medical science had deemed impossible. The road ahead remained challenging, with years of continued therapy, adaptation, and building new routines around David's limitations and capabilities. But they faced that future together, as a family restored not just to each other, but to hope itself, to the understanding that love can persist and even triumph in circumstances that seem designed to destroy it. Outside, snow began to fall on Millbrook, covering the small town in pristine white that seemed to symbolize new beginnings and second chances. In the Thompson household, three people who had lost each other to industrial negligence and medical catastrophe had found their way back through love, persistence, and the simple but profound power of never giving up on the people who matter most. The drawing on Marcus's nightstand showed a family walking hand in hand toward a bright sunrise. And for the first time in over 6 years, that future seemed not just possible, but inevitable to those who had learned that life's greatest battles are often fought in hospital corridors, at kitchen tables, and in quiet moments when love proves stronger than despair. To those who understand that ordinary people become extraordinary when they refuse to abandon the ones they love, this story speaks to truths that transcend medical charts and legal settlements. You've lived long enough to know that tragedy strikes without warning. A phone call that changes everything. A diagnosis that rewrites your future. A moment when the person you've built your life around suddenly isn't there in the ways you've always known them. You felt the weight of impossible decisions, the exhaustion of carrying burdens that seemed too heavy for human shoulders to bear. But you also know something that younger generations are still learning, that the greatest victories aren't always measured in complete healing or perfect outcomes, but in the simple act of showing up day after day, speaking love into darkness, and believing that somewhere in the silence, the people we cherish can still hear us calling them home. In David's 6 years of silence, in Alina's grinding determination to hold their family together, in Rose's guilt-driven devotion that transformed into genuine family love, and in Marcus's innocent faith that refused to accept impossibility, we see reflections of our own struggles to keep families intact against overwhelming odds. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on at all costs, but finding the courage to make impossible decisions with grace and dignity. Sometimes healing looks different than we expected, and sometimes the people who return to us are both exactly who they always were and completely transformed by their journey through darkness. The power of persistent connection, of refusing to let go even when hope seems foolish, of believing that love can reach across the vast distances created by trauma and medical catastrophe. These are the forces that occasionally create what doctors call miracles, but what families know as the simple truth that some bonds cannot be broken by accident, injury, or even the apparent finality of death itself. In hospital rooms and rehabilitation centers, in courtrooms where justice slowly unfolds, in classrooms where teachers learn to see beyond surface behaviors to the complex stories children carry, in the daily acts of showing up for people who cannot show up for themselves. This is where real heroism lives, quiet and persistent, and ultimately more powerful than any single dramatic gesture. The Thompson family story reminds us that recovery takes many forms, that families can be rebuilt even after they seem irretrievably broken, and that children often possess a wisdom about love and persistence that adults spend lifetimes trying to reclaim. In the end, what saved them wasn't medical intervention alone, but the combined power of never giving up, seeking justice for preventable harm, and maintaining the kind of connection that reaches across impossible distances to call loved ones home. The infection that revealed a century-old secret, A father's fight for truth and healing Michael Blake's calloused hands moved with careful precision across the oak wood. Each stroke of his carving tool measured and deliberate. The small wooden airplane was almost finished, a birthday gift for his 9-year-old son Daniel, crafted with the kind of patience that only comes from deep paternal love. Outside his modest workshop, the November wind howled through the trees surrounding his cabin. But inside, the air was thick with the comforting smell of wood dust and the focused concentration of a man determined to create something perfect for his child. Without any warning, a searing agony erupted through his left thigh, so sudden and intense that his carving knife clattered onto the workbench as Michael doubled over. His prosthetic right leg, a constant reminder of his service in Iraq, couldn't support his collapsing weight. Blood began seeping through his work jeans, spreading in a dark stain that made no sense. He hadn't cut himself, hadn't fallen, hadn't done anything that could explain the burning pain that felt like molten metal flowing through his flesh. 3 weeks later, when Dr. Lisa Chen carefully removed the bandages covering what had become a cluster of deep, weeping wounds in Michael's thigh, each one perfectly circular and descending into darkness like small craters carved into living tissue, the sight made her steady surgical hands tremble. In 15 years of emergency medicine, she had never seen anything like this. It wasn't any ordinary infection. Please leave your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Now let's continue with this extraordinary story. Cedar Falls, North Carolina had always been the kind of small mountain community where everyone knew your history before you finished introducing yourself. Nestled in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the town displayed its autumn colors like a scenic postcard. But beneath the picturesque surface lay the familiar tensions between old established families and newcomers, between those who had been there for generations and those still trying to prove they belonged. Michael Blake had never quite fit into either category. At 36, he carried himself with the careful posture of a man who had learned to compensate for what he'd lost. His right leg, taken by a roadside bomb on a convoy route outside Baghdad 3 years earlier, had been replaced with a state-of-the-art prosthetic that functioned well, but served as a daily reminder of the soldier he used to be: confident, whole, capable of providing for his family without question. Now he made his living as a furniture maker, his skilled hands creating what his damaged body could no longer pursue in more physical work. His modest cabin sat on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, deliberately positioned away from the watchful eyes of neighbors who still whispered about his divorce, his disability, and his well-documented struggle with alcohol that had nearly destroyed everything he cared about. The workshop behind his house had become his refuge, filled with half-completed projects and the tools his grandfather had passed down, tools that still carried the scent of the old man's pipe tobacco and the weight of family expectations Michael wasn't certain he could fulfill. Daniel Blake was the reason Michael found the strength to face each new day. 9 years old, with his mother's quick intelligence and his father's determined spirit, Daniel navigated the world with the careful observation of a child who noticed things others missed. The doctors had diagnosed him with high-functioning autism, but Michael preferred to call it his son's unique way of seeing the world. While other children played video games, Daniel created detailed drawings that seemed to map invisible landscapes, his colored pencils bringing to life patterns that reminded Michael of something ancient and significant, though he couldn't quite identify what. The boy now lived between two worlds, weekdays with his mother Rachel in her pristine apartment in town, weekends with Michael in the comfortable chaos of the cabin. Rachel Blake had transformed herself into everything Michael was not. Successful, polished, connected to the right social circles. Her position as a corporate attorney and her engagement to William Thornton, heir to the local textile fortune, painted a picture of stability that the family court found increasingly appealing. Dr. Lisa Chen represented everything the established families of Cedar Falls valued: third-generation money, impeccable medical credentials, and a surgical practice that served the wealthy with discreet efficiency. At 44, she had never married, dedicating herself instead to maintaining the family legacy and meeting the expectations that came with the Chen name. The morning of Michael's expedition into the Blue Ridge wilderness dawned cold and overcast, with the kind of November chill that penetrated even the thickest clothing. He had misled Rachel about his plans, telling her he was spending the day working on a cabinet commission for the Andersons. The truth was far more desperate, and he knew far more damaging to his already fragile custody situation. His grandfather's pocket watch had been lost somewhere in these mountains 4 years ago, during what would be their final camping trip together before the old man's stroke. The watch bore an engraving that had been passed down through 5 generations of Blake men. Time heals all wounds. Michael's grandfather had pressed it into his grandson's palm the night before he deployed to Iraq, making him promise to give it to Daniel when the boy came of age. "It's all we have left of who we used to be," the old man had whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of family history that Michael had never fully grasped. Now, with the custody hearing just 3 days away, Michael felt the watch's absence like a physical ache. Rachel's attorneys had painted him as unstable, unreliable, a damaged veteran who couldn't provide the security Daniel needed. But if he could find the watch, if he could place it in Daniel's small hands and share the stories his grandfather had told, maybe the boy would always carry a piece of his father with him, regardless of what the court decided. The trailhead was marked with signs warning about private property and restricted access. But Michael had grown up exploring these mountains before the state had purchased them from the old logging companies. He knew the paths that weren't on any official maps, the deer trails that wound through sections of forest that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. His prosthetic made the hiking more challenging, but he pushed through the discomfort, driven by a desperation that felt like drowning. The accident occurred near what his grandfather had called Devil's Canyon, a depression in the forest floor where the trees grew thin and the undergrowth seemed perpetually dead. Michael was carefully navigating down a steep slope, using his walking stick to test each step, when the rotted branch beneath his left foot gave way completely. He tumbled sideways into a rocky ledge, his thigh striking a sharp piece of stone that jutted from the hillside like a broken blade. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but what made Michael's blood freeze was the stone itself. Even through his torn jeans and the blood that was already saturating the fabric, he could see symbols carved deep into the rock's surface, spirals and geometric shapes that looked intentionally placed, purposeful. They weren't the random marks of weathering or animal activity, but something far older, something that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the gray mountain light. The gash in his thigh was deeper than he had initially realized, blood flowing steadily despite the pressure he applied with his torn flannel shirt. But worse than the bleeding was the burning sensation that began immediately, as if the stone had been heated in a furnace. The pain radiated outward from the wound in waves, and Michael found himself gasping, his vision blurring at the edges as he struggled to understand what was happening to him. His cell phone showed no signal bars, which didn't surprise him this deep in the restricted area. Michael fashioned a makeshift bandage from his shirt and began the excruciating journey back to his truck, every step sending fresh fire through his leg. The symbols on the stone seemed burned into his memory, their angular lines following him through the darkening forest like accusatory eyes. By the time he reached the urgent care clinic in town, Michael had lost enough blood to make him lightheaded and confused. The young doctor on duty, fresh out of residency, and clearly eager to handle anything more exciting than sinus infections and minor sprains, cleaned the wound with professional efficiency and declared it a straightforward laceration. "You're fortunate," Dr. Patterson said, preparing his suture kit. "Missed all the major blood vessels. This should heal up perfectly with some antibiotics and proper wound care." He paused, studying the wound more closely under the examination light. "Interesting pattern, though. What exactly did you say you fell on?" Michael chose his words carefully. "Just some rocks. Old quarry stone, probably." He couldn't bring himself to mention the symbols, couldn't explain the feeling that something had been deliberately waiting for him in those mountains. The stitches pulled tight as Dr. Patterson worked, but Michael barely felt them. All his attention was focused on the burning sensation that seemed to be growing stronger rather than weaker, as if whatever had been on that stone was now working its way deeper into his flesh, following pathways that had nothing to do with human anatomy and everything to do with something far older and more unforgiving. The infection began on the 4th day after Michael's return from the mountains, starting as a subtle warmth around the sutured wound that he initially attributed to normal healing. But by Friday morning, as he sat across from Rachel and her attorney in the sterile conference room of the family court building, the burning had intensified to the point where he could barely focus on the custody proceedings. "Mr. Blake, you appear distracted," observed Judge Patricia Williams, her sharp eyes fixed on Michael from behind designer glasses. "This is a serious matter concerning your son's welfare." Michael forced himself to sit straighter, ignoring the fire that seemed to be spreading along his thigh like spilled gasoline. "I'm fine, Your Honor. Just tired from work." Rachel's attorney, a polished woman in an expensive suit, leaned forward with the predatory grace of someone who sensed weakness. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of instability we've been discussing. Mr. Blake's inability to focus, his obvious physical discomfort, these are symptoms of the PTSD and substance abuse issues that make him unfit for custody." "I'm not using," Michael said through gritted teeth, his hand instinctively moving toward his thigh before he caught himself. "I've been sober for 10 months. "Then what explains your current condition?" Rachel asked, her voice carrying the cold professional tone she'd perfected in her corporate law practice. "You're perspiring, you can barely sit still, and frankly, Michael, you look terrible." It was true. Michael had caught sight of himself in the courthouse restroom mirror and been shocked by what he saw. Pale, hollow-eyed, with the kind of drawn expression that spoke of pain beyond normal tolerance. The wound had developed a strange appearance over the past day, the single gash seeming to separate into multiple smaller openings, each one perfectly round and unnaturally deep. The mediation was suspended when Michael suddenly doubled over, his face draining of color as the burning sensation spiked to unbearable levels. The bailiff called for an ambulance, and within minutes, Michael found himself being wheeled into Cedar Falls General Hospital, Rachel following behind, with a mixture of genuine concern and legal calculation in her eyes. Dr. Lisa Chen was completing her evening rounds when the emergency call came through. As head of trauma surgery, she was accustomed to dealing with the aftermath of accidents, violence, and human frailty. But something about this case made her pause in the hospital corridor, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The patient was a disabled veteran named Michael Blake, a name that stirred something in the depths of her memory, though she couldn't immediately place why. When she examined the wound on his thigh, her professional composure nearly cracked. The injury had evolved from a simple laceration into something she had never encountered in 18 years of surgical practice. "When did this happen?" she asked Michael, who was struggling to maintain consciousness despite the obvious agony. 5 days ago, he managed between shallow breaths. "Cut it on some rocks in the mountains." Dr. Chen studied the wound more closely under the examination light. What she saw defied medical explanation. Multiple perfectly circular openings, each about the size of a quarter, arranged in a pattern that reminded her of something ancient and deliberate. The tissue around each hole was inflamed and weeping, but the inflammation followed lines that seemed too organized, too purposeful for random infection. "We need to run blood cultures immediately," she told the attending nurse, "and I want a tissue sample sent to pathology." As the medical team worked around him, Michael caught fragments of their whispered conversations, words like necrotizing fasciitis and unusual bacterial presentation, that sent ice through his veins despite the fever that was beginning to consume him. Through the haze of pain medication, he saw Rachel standing in the doorway, her cell phone pressed to her ear, already calling her attorney to discuss emergency custody motions. Daniel appeared at his bedside sometime during the night, having convinced his grandmother to bring him to the hospital despite Rachel's objections. The 9-year-old took one look at his father's condition and pulled out his ever-present sketch pad, his colored pencils moving across the paper with unusual urgency. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Michael whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of fighting the pain. Daniel held up the paper, revealing a detailed drawing of the forest clearing where Michael had been injured. But in the child's version, the clearing wasn't empty. It was filled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted with anguish and rage, surrounding a stone altar covered in the same symbols Michael remembered from the rock that had wounded him. "The sad people," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "They've been trying to talk to me since you got hurt. They're really upset about something that happened a long time ago." Dr. Chen overheard the conversation as she checked Michael's chart, and something cold settled in her stomach. Her own family had deep roots in the Blue Ridge region, roots that went back over a century to when her great-grandfather had been involved in land acquisitions that had displaced several Cherokee communities. The boy's drawing, with its primitive but accurate depiction of burial practices and spiritual symbolism, looked disturbingly familiar. That night, as Michael's condition worsened despite aggressive antibiotic treatment, Chen found herself in the hospital's medical library, researching historical accounts of similar infections in the region. What she discovered in the dusty archives made her hands shake as she turned the yellowed pages of century-old medical journals, each one documenting cases eerily similar to Michael's, and each one connected to families who had been involved in the systematic displacement and destruction of the local Cherokee settlements. The medical archives in Cedar Falls General's basement had not been disturbed in decades, their dust-covered volumes containing secrets that most of the town's current residents had forgotten or chosen to ignore. Dr. Lisa Chen spent 4 sleepless nights poring over handwritten case files and yellowed newspaper clippings, each document adding another piece to a puzzle that made her stomach churn with growing dread. The pattern was undeniable. Between 1924 and 1926, 21 men had been admitted to the Old Cedar Falls Clinic with identical symptoms to Michael's. Mysterious wounds that developed into clusters of perfectly round holes, accompanied by fever, delirium, and eventually death in all but 4 cases. The survivors had all done the same thing, publicly confessed to their involvement in what the medical records euphemistically referred to as the clearing incident of autumn 1923. Lisa's hands trembled as she opened a manila folder marked Confidential Blake, Samuel 1925. The photograph clipped to the inside cover showed a man who could have been Michael's twin, down to the same determined jawline and haunted eyes. Samuel Blake had been one of the survivors, and his detailed statement to the attending physician painted a picture of horror that Lisa wished she could unsee. Chief Joseph Whitehawk appeared at the hospital on the 5th morning, walking through the corridors with the quiet dignity of a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. At 71, he carried himself like someone who had witnessed enough sorrow to fill several lifetimes, his weathered face bearing the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment for far too long. "Dr. Chen," he said, approaching Lisa in the hospital cafeteria, where she sat surrounded by historical documents and cold coffee. "I believe we need to speak about your patient." Lisa looked up from a 1923 newspaper article describing the accidental fire that had destroyed a Cherokee settlement, leaving no survivors. The byline credited the reporting to her great-grandfather, William Chen, whose elaborate prose had painted the incident as an unfortunate consequence of progress and civilization. "You're here about Michael Blake," Lisa said, not making it a question. Chief Whitehawk settled into the chair across from her, his dark eyes taking in the scattered papers with grim recognition. "I'm here about all of them, the 21 who came before him and the others who will come after if this continues." "Others," Lisa's voice caught. "You're saying this has happened before. Every few decades, when the forest decides it's time for remembering." Chief Whitehawk touched one of the photographs, his finger tracing the image of Samuel Blake's infected leg. "My grandfather was among those killed in 1923. 57 people, including 22 children, burned alive in their winter shelters while they slept. Lisa felt the cafeteria spinning around her. The newspaper had said it was an accident, a cooking fire that spread. Kerosene doesn't spread accidentally through 8 separate buildings in a snowstorm. Chief Whitehawk replied with quiet bitterness. And bullets don't accidentally find their way into the backs of people trying to escape the flames. He pulled out a leather pouch and carefully extracted a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Lisa saw a tarnished silver pocket watch, its surface inscribed with words she couldn't read. "This belonged to my grandfather. It was taken from his body, along with the bodies of the others, kept as a trophy by one of the men responsible." Chief Whitehawk's voice remained steady, but Lisa could see the decades of controlled rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. That man was Samuel Blake, Michael's great-grandfather. The revelation hit Lisa like a physical blow. She thought of Michael lying upstairs, fighting an infection that seemed to defy every medical intervention they tried. His 9-year-old son drawing pictures of angry spirits that he claimed were trying to communicate with him. "The children," Lisa whispered. "Daniel's drawings. He's been seeing them." "Children often can," Chief Whitehawk confirmed. "They don't carry the guilt that blinds adults to truth. Your patient's son has been chosen as a bridge between the living and the dead, but the crossing is dangerous for everyone involved." Lisa pushed back from the table, her medical training warring with revelations that challenged everything she thought she knew about cause and effect. "This is impossible. Infections don't work this way. Dead people don't cause disease. The infection is real," Chief Whitehawk said calmly, "but it feeds on guilt that's been passed down through generations, on secrets that have festered in family bloodlines like poison. Your great-grandfather wrote those newspaper stories to cover up mass murder. Michael's great-grandfather pulled the trigger. The bacteria you're fighting upstairs knows this, even if you don't want to believe it." Meanwhile, 4 floors above them, Michael was experiencing his own form of revelation. The fever had brought with it a series of vivid dreams that felt more like memories than products of his delirious mind. He saw his great-grandfather Samuel as a young man, standing with a group of other settlers in a circle around burning buildings. He heard the screams of families trapped inside, smelled the acrid smoke mixed with something far worse. Daniel had been spending most of his time in Michael's room, despite Rachel's attempts to limit his visits. The boy sat in the corner with his sketch pad, his drawings becoming increasingly detailed and disturbing. He drew scenes of the massacre with the accuracy of an eyewitness, including details that no 9-year-old should have known. The exact number of buildings, the names of the victims, the faces of the perpetrators. "They want their names said out loud," Daniel told his father during one of Michael's more lucid moments. "They've been waiting over 100 years for someone to remember their names." Michael tried to focus through the haze of pain medication and fever. "What names, buddy?" Daniel flipped through his sketch pad to a page covered with careful handwriting in a child's block letters. "I wrote them down the way they told me, starting with Chief Running Bear and his wife Silver Moon, and their children, Little Eagle, Bright Feather, and Baby Morning Dove." The list went on for 3 pages, each name carefully recorded with the devotion of a child taking dictation from invisible teachers. Michael felt tears streaming down his face as he realized what his son was describing. not fantasies or hallucinations, but testimony from the dead. Dr. Chen returned to Michael's room that evening to find Chief Whitehawk sitting beside the bed, speaking quietly in a language she didn't recognize, while Daniel translated in whispered English. The strange tableau should have seemed ridiculous, but something in the atmosphere of the room made Lisa hesitate in the doorway. "He's getting worse," she said finally, approaching Michael's bedside. The infection had spread despite the strongest antibiotics in their arsenal, and the tissue around the wounds was beginning to turn black. "We may need to consider amputation to save his life. Cutting away infected flesh won't heal an infected spirit," Chief Whitehawk replied, without looking up from Michael's pale face. "The sickness comes from within, from the guilt his bloodline carries. Only acknowledgement and atonement can stop it." Lisa checked Michael's chart, noting his steadily declining vital signs. "I don't care what you believe about spirits and bloodlines. I care about saving this man's life, and conventional medicine isn't working." "Then perhaps it's time to try unconventional medicine," Chief Whitehawk suggested. The families responsible for the massacre included the Blakes, the Chens, the Williams, and the Thornton families, all still prominent in this town, all still benefiting from the land that was stolen through murder. The names hit Lisa like bullets. Judge Williams was presiding over the custody case. Dr. Thornton was the hospital administrator who had been pressuring her to transfer Michael to psychiatric care. Her own family name was on the list, connected to a century-old crime she had never suspected. "What are you suggesting?" Lisa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Truth," Chief Whitehawk said simply. "Public acknowledgement of what happened. Return of the stolen land to its rightful people. Compensation for the families whose ancestors were murdered." He paused, his dark eyes meeting Lisa's. "And prosecution of those who have spent a century covering up the truth." Daniel looked up from his latest drawing, a detailed map of the mountains showing the exact location of the mass grave, where 57 bodies had been hastily buried after the massacre. "They say the sickness will keep spreading until everyone knows what really happened. More daddies will get hurt, and their kids will see the sad people too." Michael stirred on the bed, his fever-bright eyes focusing on his son with effort. "How many more, Daniel? How many families like ours?" The 9-year-old consulted his invisible advisors, his head tilted as if listening to whispers only he could hear. "All of them," he said finally. "Every family that helped hide the secret. The sad people are very patient, but they're tired of waiting." The medical crisis reached its peak on a gray November morning, when Michael's vital signs began crashing despite every intervention Dr. Chen and her team could deploy. His temperature spiked to 105 degrees, the infection spreading rapidly through his bloodstream as the cluster of wounds on his thigh opened wider, revealing tissue that looked more like raw meat than human flesh. The antibiotics that should have controlled any known bacterial infection seemed to feed whatever was consuming him from within. "We need to take the leg," Dr. Chen announced to the assembled medical team, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's the only way to stop this from reaching his vital organs." Chief Whitehawk, who had maintained his vigil beside Michael's bed despite hospital regulations, shook his head slowly. "Cutting away the symptom won't cure the disease, doctor. You know this by now. Daniel sat in the corner of the room, his sketch pad balanced on his knees, drawing with the focused intensity of a child receiving urgent instruction from invisible teachers. His latest picture showed the interior of a hospital room. This room, with shadowy figures surrounding the bed where his father lay dying. But in Daniel's version, the shadows weren't threatening. They were reaching toward Michael with gestures that looked almost protective. "They don't want him to die," Daniel said without looking up from his drawing. "They just want everyone to know the truth about what happened to them." Dr. Chen felt the weight of the historical documents she had discovered pressing down on her like physical stones. 4 sleepless nights of research had revealed the full scope of the 1923 massacre and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Her great-grandfather hadn't just reported on the accidental fire. He had helped plan it, using his position at the newspaper to coordinate the story that would hide mass murder beneath the veneer of tragic accident. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for that afternoon despite Michael's critical condition. Rachel Blake arrived at the hospital in full legal battle dress, accompanied by her attorney and her fiancé, William Thornton, whose textile family had also profited from the stolen Cherokee land. Judge Patricia Williams had agreed to hold the hearing in Michael's hospital room, ostensibly out of compassion, but more likely to expedite a custody decision that would remove Daniel from what everyone assumed was an increasingly unstable situation. "Mr. Blake," Judge Williams said, pulling up a chair beside Michael's bed, while the bailiff set up a makeshift courtroom in the cramped space. "I understand you're quite ill, but we need to resolve your son's custody arrangement. The court has serious concerns about your ability to provide stable care." Michael struggled to focus through the fever and pain medication. The infection had reached the point where conventional amputation might not even save his life. Dr. Chen had quietly informed him that the bacteria seemed to be adapting to every treatment they tried, as if it possessed intelligence beyond normal medical understanding. "I can take care of Daniel," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "He needs his father." Rachel's attorney leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "Mr. Blake, look at yourself. You're dying from an infection you caught stumbling around in the mountains like some kind of vagrant. What kind of example does that set for a vulnerable child?" Daniel suddenly stood up from his corner, his sketch pad clutched tightly in his small hands. "My daddy isn't dying because he's bad. He's dying because his great-great-grandpa did something terrible, and nobody ever said sorry." "Daniel, honey, you're confused," Rachel said, moving to collect her son. "Your father is sick because he makes poor choices and doesn't take care of himself properly." "No," Daniel pulled away from his mother, his voice rising with 9-year-old indignation. "The burned people told me everything. They showed me what really happened in the mountains, and they showed me the secret everyone's been keeping." Judge Williams exchanged glances with Rachel's attorney, both women clearly viewing Daniel's outburst as further evidence of the trauma and instability surrounding Michael's influence. "Son, you're upset because your father is ill, but these fantasies about burned people aren't helping anyone." Daniel marched to the center of the room and held up his latest drawing, a detailed map of Cedar Falls showing property lines and family names stretching back over a century. "Judge Williams, your great-grandpa was there too." So was Dr. Chen's and Mr. Thornton's. They all helped kill the Indian families and steal their land, and then they all got rich from it. The silence that followed Daniel's declaration was deafening. Dr. Chen felt her face drain of color as she recognized the accuracy of the property boundaries Daniel had drawn. Boundaries that exactly matched the historical documents she had discovered. Judge Williams's expression hardened into something approaching panic, while William Thornton stepped forward as if to physically silence the child. This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking we're concerned about, Rachel said, her professional composure cracking slightly. Daniel has been exposed to his father's paranoid fantasies. Chief Whitehawk rose from his chair beside Michael's bed, his presence suddenly filling the room with an authority that made everyone else seem small and insignificant. The boy speaks truth that your families have spent a century trying to bury. 57 of my people were murdered for the land your ancestors now profit from. Their blood cries out from the soil you built your fortunes on. This is preposterous, Judge Williams snapped, though her voice carried the sharp edge of fear. We are here to discuss child custody, not entertain conspiracy theories about century-old incidents. Incidents. Chief Whitehawk's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. Is that what you call the systematic murder of children? The burning alive of families in their sleep? The bullets fired into the backs of those trying to escape the flames? Dr. Chen found herself speaking almost against her will, the words torn from some deep place of conscience she had tried to keep buried. He's telling the truth. I've seen the medical records, the newspaper files, the land transfer documents. It wasn't an accident. It was planned, coordinated, covered up. The room erupted in shocked voices as Judge Williams demanded order, and Rachel's attorney threatened sanctions for introducing irrelevant historical claims. But Daniel's clear voice cut through the chaos with the devastating honesty that only children possess. The sad people don't want to hurt anybody else, he said, his 9-year-old face serious beyond his years. They just want their names remembered and their babies' graves marked with stones so everyone knows they were real people who got killed for no good reason. Michael struggled to sit up despite the IV lines and monitoring equipment, his fever-bright eyes fixed on his son with desperate love. Daniel, what do they want from us? What do they want from me? Daniel consulted his invisible advisors, his head tilted in the listening posture that had become familiar to everyone in the room. They want you to find great-great-grandpa Samuel's watch and give it back to them. They want you to tell everyone what really happened, and they want the land back so they can bury their people properly. The watch was lost, Michael said, his voice breaking. I went into the mountains looking for it. But it's not lost, Daniel interrupted. Great-great-grandpa Samuel threw it in the sacred pool after he helped kill Chief Running Bear's family. He was so ashamed he couldn't stand to wear it anymore, but he was too scared to tell the truth about what he'd done. Chief Whitehawk stepped closer to Michael's bed, his weathered face showing something that might have been compassion. The watch can be recovered. The truth can be told. The dead can be properly honored. But it requires courage that your ancestor didn't possess. The courage to face shame publicly and accept the consequences of inherited guilt. Dr. Chen watched Michael's vital signs on the monitors, seeing the impossible truth that conventional medicine couldn't explain. His condition was somehow responding to the emotional and spiritual dynamics playing out in the room. When the historical truth was spoken aloud, his fever dropped slightly. When the denials and cover-ups continued, his infection flared worse. "If I confess what my family did," Michael asked, his voice barely audible, "will you help my son? Will you help me live long enough to be the father he deserves?" Daniel took his father's hand, his small fingers surprisingly strong. "The burned people already forgave you, Daddy. They just want everyone else to know they were here and that their lives mattered too." The confession that Michael Blake broadcast live from his hospital bed shattered more than just his own remaining dignity. It destroyed the carefully constructed mythology that had sustained Cedar Falls' most prominent families for nearly a century. Speaking directly into a local news camera that Daniel had somehow convinced a sympathetic reporter to bring into the room, Michael's fever-weakened voice carried the weight of inherited shame that had been festering in his bloodline like an untreated wound. "My great-grandfather Samuel Blake led a group of men into the Cherokee winter settlement on October 20th, 1923, Michael said, his words slurred by pain medication, but crystal clear in their intent. "They waited until the families were asleep, then set fire to the buildings and shot anyone who tried to escape. 57 people died, including 22 children under the age of 10. The immediate response was devastating. Judge Williams, caught on camera during what was supposed to be a private custody hearing, stood frozen as Michael continued his public revelation. Her own family's involvement, her great-grandfather had provided the kerosene and coordinated the alibis, was laid bare with the methodical precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. The land was redistributed among the families who participated in the massacre," Michael continued, his eyes fixed on the camera with the desperate intensity of a dying man making his final confession. "The Chen family got the newspaper to report it as an accidental fire. The Williams family handled the legal paperwork to transfer the land titles. The Thornton family arranged for the bodies to be buried in unmarked graves." Dr. Chen watched the broadcast from the nurse's station, her hands trembling as she saw her family's century-old crimes exposed to the entire community. Her pager was already buzzing with calls from the hospital board, from family members, from lawyers who were undoubtedly preparing damage control strategies. But all she could think about was the historical documents hidden in her office, the photographs of burned children that matched the faces in Daniel's drawings with horrifying accuracy. The legal consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Within hours of Michael's confession, the district attorney's office announced an investigation into what they termed historical civil rights violations and conspiracy to conceal evidence of mass murder. The FBI was contacted about potential federal charges related to the systematic destruction of Native American communities. Civil rights lawyers from across the country began calling Chief Whitehawk, offering to represent the surviving Cherokee families in what promised to be the largest reparations case in state history. But for Michael, the most devastating consequence was watching his confession being used against him in real time. Rachel's attorney immediately petitioned for emergency custody transfer, arguing that Michael's delusional fantasies about century-old massacres proved his complete mental breakdown. Judge Williams, despite her own family's implication in Michael's revelations, seemed eager to rule against him as quickly as possible. Mr. Blake has demonstrated a complete disconnection from reality, Rachel testified, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around the room. He's teaching our son to believe in ghosts and conspiracy theories. This is exactly the kind of harmful influence we need to protect Daniel from. Daniel himself seemed to age years in the span of hours, his 9-year-old face carrying a burden that no child should bear. The boy had stopped drawing, stopped speaking to his invisible advisors, and instead sat quietly beside his father's bed, with the hollow expression of someone who had seen too much truth too quickly. "I shouldn't have told," Daniel whispered to Michael during a brief moment when they were alone. "Now everyone's mad and scared, and they want to take me away from you forever." Michael's condition had worsened dramatically since his confession, as if the act of speaking the truth had somehow unleashed whatever was consuming him from within. The infection spread with renewed fury, the cluster of wounds on his thigh opening deeper, revealing tissue that looked more like ancient battlefield damage than any modern medical condition. Dr. Chen had quietly informed him that amputation was no longer a viable option. The infection had progressed too far to be stopped by conventional surgical intervention. "I'm going to die," Michael told Chief Whitehawk during one of the old man's vigils. "And when I do, they'll take Daniel and tell him everything I said was the ramblings of a sick man. The truth will die with me." Chief Whitehawk studied Michael's deteriorating condition with the patient gaze of someone who had witnessed many forms of suffering. Truth doesn't die just because the one speaking it passes on. Your son carries the memories now. The spirits have chosen him as their voice, and that cannot be undone by judges or lawyers. The community's reaction to Michael's revelation split along predictable lines. The working-class families who had always resented the old money dynasties saw vindication in the exposure of century-old crimes. But the established power structure closed ranks with predictable efficiency, launching a coordinated campaign to discredit Michael as a mentally unstable veteran whose combat trauma had manifested in elaborate historical fantasies. Dr. Thornton, the hospital administrator whose own family was implicated in the cover-up, began pressuring Dr. Chen to have Michael transferred to the psychiatric ward. "This man is clearly delusional," Thornton insisted during an emergency meeting. "His claims are damaging the reputation of several prominent families based on nothing but the fantasies of a traumatized veteran and his autistic child." The medical ethics became impossible to navigate. Dr. Chen knew that Michael's infection was real, progressive, and deadly. But she also knew that his claims about its spiritual origins would be dismissed by any medical review board. She found herself caught between her Hippocratic oath to first do no harm and her growing conviction that conventional medicine had no answers for what was killing Michael Blake. Daniel's custody hearing proceeded despite the chaos, with Judge Williams determined to resolve the case before her own family's legal troubles could compromise her position. The boy was questioned by child psychologists, who concluded that his elaborate fantasy system about communicating with dead Cherokee was a trauma response to his father's mental deterioration. The child has been exposed to a highly disturbed parent who has convinced him that his hallucinations are real the court-appointed psychologist testified. Continued exposure to this environment will cause permanent psychological damage. As Michael slipped deeper into fever-induced delirium, he began speaking in what Chief Whitehawk recognized as fragments of the Cherokee language, words that no white man in Cedar Falls should have known, names of the dead that had been forgotten for nearly a century. The old man recorded these utterances on his phone, knowing they would serve as evidence that something beyond medical science was at work. The final blow came when Judge Williams, despite her own family's implication in the historical crimes Michael had revealed, ruled that his confession constituted clear evidence of mental incompetence. Daniel was awarded to Rachel's custody immediately, with Michael's visitation rights suspended indefinitely pending psychiatric evaluation. This court finds that Mr. Blake's recent statements demonstrate a complete break from reality that poses a danger to his child's psychological well-being, Judge Williams announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone desperate to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. Daniel was removed from the hospital room by social services, while Michael lay unconscious, burning with fever that no medication could touch. The boy's last act before being led away was to leave his sketch pad on his father's bedside table, open to a drawing that showed Michael and Daniel walking together through a forest where the angry spirits had finally found peace. The revelation that changed everything came not from the living, but from the most unlikely source imaginable. Daniel Blake's final drawing, left behind when social services removed him from his father's hospital room. Dr. Chen discovered it the next morning, open to a page that made her hands shake as she studied the intricate details that no 9-year-old should have been able to produce. The drawing depicted the sacred pool in Devil's Canyon with photographic accuracy, showing not just the surface water, but what lay beneath. Dozens of skeletal remains arranged in ceremonial burial positions, and at the center, a silver pocket watch glinting among the bones of what appeared to be a child. But it was the notation written in Daniel's careful block letters that stopped Dr. Chen's breath entirely. Little Star, age 7, daughter of Chief Running Bear. She tried to save the watch when the bad men came. Chief Whitehawk arrived at the hospital that afternoon carrying a metal detector and wearing the grim expression of a man preparing to excavate his own family's graves. Word of Daniel's drawing had reached him through the network of Native activists who had descended on Cedar Falls following Michael's public confession. And he knew that the boy's visions were about to be validated in the most heartbreaking way possible. The child saw true, Chief Whitehawk told Dr. Chen, as they stood beside Michael's unconscious form. Little Star was my great-niece. She was 7 years old when they killed her, trying to protect the sacred objects from the men who burned our village. The expedition to Devil's Canyon took place at dawn, before the media circus and legal injunctions could prevent it. Chief Whitehawk led a small group that included Dr. Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the State University, and a documentary filmmaker who had driven through the night from Charlotte when news of the discovery broke. Michael remained in the hospital, hovering between life and death while machines monitored his failing vital signs. What they found beneath the murky water of the sacred pool validated every detail of Daniel's impossible knowledge. The skeletal remains of 57 individuals lay arranged in a hasty mass grave, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of violence. Bullet holes, fire damage, trauma consistent with a massacre rather than any natural disaster. Among the adult remains were the smaller skeletons of children, their bones fragile as bird wings, their positioning suggesting they had died trying to protect each other. And clutched in the tiny finger bones of what the forensic anthropologist confirmed was a 7-year-old girl was a tarnished silver pocket watch, its inscription still barely legible after nearly a century underwater. Time heals all wounds. The discovery shattered the last vestiges of denial that had protected Cedar Falls establishment families. Physical evidence of mass murder, documented by forensic science and photographed by news crews, could not be dismissed as the fantasies of a disturbed veteran. The FBI opened a federal investigation into civil rights violations and conspiracy to conceal evidence of genocide. The state attorney general announced criminal charges against several prominent families for their ancestors' crimes and their own efforts to maintain the cover-up. But the most dramatic change came in Daniel Blake himself. The moment Chief Whitehawk returned to the hospital carrying his great-great-grandfather's watch, the boy underwent a transformation that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Daniel, who had been withdrawn and nearly catatonic since being removed from his father's room, suddenly began speaking with clarity and purpose that seemed far beyond his 9 years. "The sad people aren't sad anymore," Daniel announced to the assembled crowd of family members, lawyers, and medical staff. They just wanted someone to know their names and remember that they were real people who loved their children too. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as Michael's vital signs began improving for the first time in days. His fever broke suddenly, his blood pressure stabilized, and the horrific infection that had been consuming his thigh began to recede with a speed that defied every principle of modern medicine. The cluster of wounds that had looked like portals to hell itself started closing, leaving behind tissue that appeared healthier than it had been before his original injury. The legal reversal was equally dramatic. Judge Williams, facing federal investigation for her role in covering up historical crimes, recused herself from all cases involving the Blake family. The new judge, brought in from outside the district to avoid conflicts of interest, reviewed Daniel's situation with fresh eyes, unburdened by century-old conspiracies. It appears this child has been traumatized not by his father's mental illness, but by being forced to carry the burden of historical truth that adults refuse to acknowledge. Judge Maria Rodriguez observed during an emergency hearing. His so-called hallucinations have been validated by forensic evidence. His father's delusions have been confirmed by FBI investigators. Rachel Blake's case for custody collapsed entirely when it was revealed that her fiancé, William Thornton's family, had been among the primary beneficiaries of the stolen Cherokee land. Her law firm, which had represented several of the implicated families for decades, faced its own investigation for potential obstruction of justice. The woman who had built her career on ruthless ambition found herself professionally ruined by the exposure of crimes she had never committed, but had unconsciously benefited from her entire life. The most shocking revelation came when Chief Whitehawk presented Daniel with a leather-bound journal that had been hidden in his family's possessions for nearly a century. The journal belonged to Little Star, the 7-year-old girl who had died protecting the sacred watch, and it contained drawings that were identical to the pictures Daniel had been creating throughout his father's illness. "She's been trying to tell her story through your son," Chief Whitehawk explained to Michael, who was finally conscious and lucid for the first time in weeks. "The spirits of murdered children don't rest easy, but they don't seek revenge. They seek justice, acknowledgement, the simple dignity of being remembered as real people who mattered." Daniel opened the ancient journal to a page that showed his own face, drawn with startling accuracy, standing beside a hospital bed where a man with his father's features lay dying. But in Little Star's century-old drawing, the man was healing, rising from his sick bed to embrace his son, while ghostly figures of Cherokee families looked on with expressions of peace rather than anger. Dr. Chen found herself weeping as she read the medical reports documenting Michael's impossible recovery. The infection that should have killed him had not just disappeared. It had left behind tissue that showed no scarring, no sign that he had ever been ill. The cluster of wounds that had threatened to consume his leg was replaced by skin that looked healthier than it had been before his accident in the mountains. Medical science has no explanation for what we've witnessed, she admitted to the assembled media during a press conference that would reshape her career from conventional surgery toward integrative healing practices. Sometimes the cure for generational trauma requires more than antibiotics and surgical intervention. Sometimes it requires truth, acknowledgement, and the courage to face our family's darkest secrets. The federal investigation ultimately led to criminal charges against several living family members who had actively participated in covering up the historical crimes. Dr. Thornton was arrested for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Judge Williams faced federal charges for judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. The Chen family's newspaper empire, built on the foundation of covering up mass murder, faced bankruptcy as advertisers fled and readers canceled subscriptions. But perhaps the most profound change was in Daniel himself, who had somehow transformed from a traumatized child into a bridge between two worlds. His final drawing, created after his father's recovery and their reunion, showed the sacred pool as it appeared now. Clean, peaceful, surrounded by proper grave markers bearing the names of all 57 victims. In the center of the image, 2 children played together beside the water. Little Star, no longer angry or frightened, and Daniel Blake, no longer burdened by secrets too heavy for a child to carry. The burned people went home, Daniel explained to his father as they prepared to leave the hospital together. They just wanted everyone to know they were here and that their lives mattered too. Now they can rest. The spring morning when Michael Blake walked out of Cedar Falls General Hospital marked not just his physical recovery, but the beginning of a healing process that would transform an entire community. Daniel skipped beside his father, clutching the leather journal that had belonged to Little Star, his 9-year-old face radiant with the kind of peace that comes from finally being believed rather than dismissed as delusional. The custody arrangement was formalized without contest. Rachel Blake, her legal career in ruins and her engagement dissolved, had come to understand that her son's gift was real, and that Michael's love for Daniel transcended any conventional measure of fitness as a parent. She hugged them both outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her face as she whispered her first genuine apology in years. I was so focused on what I thought stability looked like that I couldn't see what Daniel actually needed, she admitted to Michael as they stood on the courthouse steps. He needed a father brave enough to tell the truth, even when it cost him everything. The Blake cabin became the unlikely center of a reconciliation process that drew Cherokee families from across the Southeast. Chief Whitehawk had put out word through tribal networks that the Cedar Falls massacre victims had finally been acknowledged, their remains properly identified and prepared for ceremonial burial. The response was overwhelming. Descendants of survivors who had scattered across the continent began returning to witness the first honest reckoning their families had seen in nearly a century. Michael threw himself into the work of atonement with the same intensity that had once driven him through combat zones in Iraq. Using his carpentry skills and every dollar from the settlement the federal government awarded to the Blake family, he began constructing a memorial at the site of the original Cherokee village. The design came from Daniel's drawings, which seemed to channel Little Star's memories of how the settlement had looked before the massacre. Dr. Lisa Chen's transformation was equally profound. Stripped of her family's wealth, but freed from the burden of inherited guilt, she left her position at Cedar Falls General to establish a clinic that integrated traditional Cherokee healing practices with modern medicine. Chief Whitehawk became her partner in developing treatment protocols that addressed what they termed generational trauma syndrome, the way historical violence could manifest in physical illness across family lines. We're learning that some wounds go deeper than tissue and bone. Dr. Chen explained to a gathering of medical professionals who had come to study the unprecedented healing that had occurred in Michael's case. Guilt and shame can literally poison the body across generations, but so can acknowledgement and forgiveness. The memorial service for the massacre victims took place on a brilliant November morning, exactly 100 years after their deaths. Over 400 people gathered at the sacred pool, now restored to its original clarity, and surrounded by carved stone markers bearing each victim's name and age. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Cherokee, with Daniel serving as an interpreter between the living participants and the spiritual presence that everyone could feel, but only he could see clearly. Chief Whitehawk spoke the names of the dead with the reverence of a man honoring his own family, which they were. Little Star, age 7. Swift Fox, age 5. Dancing Brook, just 10 months old when the flames took her. Bright Hawk, age 11, who had tried to lead the younger children to safety. Each name carved into stone, each life acknowledged after a century of enforced silence. Michael stood before the assembled crowd, holding his great-great-grandfather's watch, which had been cleaned and polished until the inscription shone like new. This watch was supposed to represent time healing all wounds, he said, his voice carrying across the water. Instead, it became a symbol of how fear and greed can corrupt even the most sacred promises. Today we return it to its rightful place, not as a trophy of conquest, but as a pledge that time really can heal all wounds when we have the courage to face the truth. He placed the watch on Little Star's memorial stone, where it would remain as a permanent reminder of both the depths of human cruelty and the possibility of redemption. Daniel stepped forward and placed his hand on the stone beside the watch, his young voice clear and strong as he delivered what he said was Little Star's final message. She says, "Thank you for remembering that we were children who played and laughed and loved our families, just like children everywhere." She says, "The angry time is over, and now comes the healing time." The legal consequences continued to unfold throughout the following months. The federal investigation resulted in the largest reparations settlement in southeastern history, with the descendants of the perpetrator families required to return significant portions of their ancestral land holdings to the Cherokee Nation. The Thornton family's textile empire collapsed under the weight of federal sanctions and public boycotts. The Chen newspaper chain was sold to pay damages, its century of influence ending in bankruptcy and disgrace. But the most meaningful changes were personal rather than legal. Daniel Blake became something of a phenomenon among child psychologists and spiritual healers. His case study referenced in papers about the intersection of trauma healing and what some researchers began calling inherited memory. He handled the attention with the same matter-of-fact grace he had shown throughout the crisis, more interested in his drawing and his friendship with Little Star's spirit than in the academic theories his experiences had inspired. Michael's recovery became complete in ways that surprised even Dr. Chen. Not only had his infected wounds healed without scarring, but his prosthetic leg began fitting more comfortably. His PTSD symptoms diminished significantly, and his furniture-making work reached a level of artistry that brought clients from across the state. It was as if acknowledging and atoning for his family's historical crimes had lifted a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. The memorial site became a pilgrimage destination for families dealing with their own generational trauma. Cherokee families came to honor ancestors who had been murdered in similar massacres across the country. African American families came to learn about healing inherited wounds from slavery and segregation. Even white families began arriving, seeking guidance on how to acknowledge and atone for their ancestors' participation in historical injustices. Chief Whitehawk, now in his 70s, found new purpose as a teacher and healer, working with Dr. Chen to develop protocols for what they called historical healing. Their methods were unconventional by Western standards, but remarkably effective, combining traditional medicine with truth-telling, ritual acknowledgement, and community support for families brave enough to face their darkest inheritances. 1 year after the memorial service, Michael and Daniel returned to the sacred pool for a private ceremony of their own. Daniel had grown taller, his face losing some of its childish roundness, but he still carried the leather journal everywhere and still drew pictures that seemed to channel knowledge beyond his years. "Little Star wants to show you something," Daniel said, opening the journal to a page Michael had never seen before. The drawing showed the Blake cabin, but not as it currently existed. This version was surrounded by gardens where Cherokee and European plants grew together, with children of different races playing in the yard, while adults worked side by side on construction projects. She says this is what it could look like if more people choose healing instead of hiding, Daniel explained, his 9-year-old voice carrying wisdom that made Michael's chest tight with pride and wonder. As they walked back through the forest that had once seemed cursed, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. The infection that had nearly killed him had also saved him, forcing him to confront truths that could have remained buried for another century. The spirits that Daniel saw weren't angry anymore, because they no longer needed to be. Their stories had been heard, their names remembered, their deaths acknowledged as the crimes they were rather than the accidents history had pretended them to be. The sun was setting as they reached their cabin, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Michael of the hope he had thought he'd lost forever. Daniel ran ahead to start his homework, chattering about a school project on local history that would be the first in Cedar Falls curriculum to include the truth about the 1923 massacre. Michael paused on his front porch, looking back toward the mountains where his great-great-grandfather's watch now rested on a child's grave, transformed from a symbol of shame into a promise of redemption. The infection was gone, the fever broken, the wounds healed, but more than his body had been restored. His family line had been cleansed of a century of inherited guilt. His son freed to grow up, without carrying the burden of secrets too heavy for any child to bear. Inside the cabin, Daniel was already at the kitchen table with his colored pencils, working on a new drawing that showed Michael and little Star as children, playing together beside the sacred pool in a world where time had truly healed all wounds. Above them, in little Star's careful script, were the words that would guide the Blake family into whatever future awaited them. Some stories end in sadness, but all stories can begin again in hope. As Michael watched his son draw the healing they had found together, he understood that this was what time healing all wounds really meant. Not the absence of pain or the denial of wrong, but the courage to face the worst truths and choose forgiveness anyway, creating space for new stories to grow where old wounds had finally been allowed to heal. As we reach the season of our lives when grandchildren gather at our tables, and old photo albums hold more weight than new adventures, Michael Blake's story speaks to truths we've carried silently for too long. How many of us have family secrets locked away in dusty attics, whispered stories about what our grandfathers did during difficult times, the land they acquired, the neighbors who mysteriously moved away. We've spent decades protecting family reputations, teaching our children to speak carefully about the past, avoiding uncomfortable questions about how our comfortable lives were built. But Michael's courage to face his family's darkest chapter reminds us that some wounds fester across generations until someone brave enough finally speaks the truth. His infected leg wasn't just a medical crisis. It was the physical manifestation of inherited guilt, the way shame literally poisons our bodies when we carry it too long. The real healing began not with antibiotics, but with acknowledgement. As we watch our own grandchildren growing up in a world demanding honest reckonings with history, perhaps it's time to ask ourselves, what truths are we still protecting, and what healing might begin if we found the courage to speak them aloud? Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.